Section 46 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 23. The New Toryism, Imperium et Sanitas, 1874 to 1878, Part 2. Mr. Disraeli's choice of a successor was characteristic. He selected as first Viceroy under the new regime one who shared his own imaginative faculties, a brilliant man of letters and an experienced diplomatist. Lord Lytton was the son of his old friend Bulwer Lytton, and was himself known in the Republic of Letters as Owen Meredith. The first task which awaited the new Viceroy was to prepare for the fitting proclamation of the Empress. A magnificent Durbar was held at Delhi in the closing days of the year 1876, and on January 1st, 1877, a series of celebrations culminated in the proclamation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India in the presence of 63 ruling princes and amid the acclamations of the most brilliant assemblage ever brought together in British India. It was not, however, merely in order to add security to the empire that Disraeli conferred upon his mistress the imperial crown of India. He hoped also to add splendor even to her throne. This, too, was part of a deliberate policy. The principles of the English Constitution do not contemplate the absence of personal influence on the part of the sovereign, and if they did, the principles of human nature would prevent the fulfillment of such a theory. Disraeli's words were not a mere rhetorical flourish. They had conviction behind them and intention. The popularity of the Queen had touched its nadir in the last few years. During the decade which followed the Prince Consort's death, the Queen's health was less robust than usual, and once, September 1871, it gave cause for some anxiety. She felt constrained, therefore, to make her choice between assiduous attention to the routine business of the state and participation in public ceremonial. The latter was naturally distasteful to her in the early years of her widowhood, and for some time the nation was acquiescent and sympathetic. But as the years went on and the seclusion of the sovereign seemed likely to be permanent, murmurings arose and grew louder and louder. The Times lent its weight to attacks of increasing vehemence. The living, it wrote, have their claims as well as the dead. A Punch cartoon portrayed the Queen as Hermione, while Britannia, as Pauline, was made to address the Queen, "'Tis time, descend, be stone no more." The Queen was deeply pained, but quite obdurate. She was acting, she believed, in accordance with the plainest dictates of duty. Very few people know how superbly she continued to stand sentry to the business of her empire. The Queen deeply resented the reticence of her ministers on this delicate point. They might and ought, in her opinion, to have explained the situation and saved her from unmerited reproof. Mr. Gladstone, on the contrary, felt it his duty to remonstrate with her. He was genuinely alarmed lest her persistence in seclusion should weaken the hold of the monarchy upon the nation. And his alarm was not groundless. After the fall of the French Empire, there was a clearly marked wave of republican feeling in England. When the House of Commons in 1871 was asked to vote £15,000 a year to Prince Arthur, afterwards the Duke of Connaught, no less than 51 members voted in favour of reducing the grant to £10,000. There was a noisy and malignant attack on the reputed affluence of the Queen herself in the same year, and in 1872 Sir Charles Dilke, boldly avowing himself to be a convinced Republican, moved for a full parliamentary inquiry into the expenditure of the Crown. From that moment, however, the tide turned. The Queen's own illness in 1871, followed in the same year by the far more serious illness of the Prince of Wales, evoked profound sympathy among her people, and when in February 1872 the Queen attended with the Prince a service of public thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral, she received an enthusiastic welcome. The mists of prejudice were quickly dissipated, and a marked reaction in the Queen's favour set in. Her own spirits were much improved by the substitution of Disraeli for Gladstone as First Minister. Disraeli, though no sycophant, was a courtier, and the Queen gave him her confidence in a measure not bestowed upon any of his less tactful predecessors. With him, however, it was a question not of personal deference but of political principle, and the reward which he sought and found was the revival not only of the personal popularity of the sovereign, but of the place of the monarchy in the Constitution. The purchase of the canal shares, the assumption of the imperial crown of India, were parts of a coherent whole. Disraeli's attitude toward the complex problems roused into fresh life by events in the Near East was determined by precisely the same considerations. Lord Palmerston was always ready and anxious to assert the rights of Englishmen the whole world over, but his outlook upon diplomacy was, if not insular, at least European. Disraeli was the first minister since Canning, perhaps since Chatham, to think imperially. He never forgot that the Queen was the ruler of Mohammedans as well as Christians, of Asiatics, Africans, Australians, and Americans as well as Europeans. He regarded the Eastern question, therefore, with the eye of an Oriental as well as an Occidental statesman. The ink was hardly dry on the Treaty of Paris, 1856, before it became obvious that the Crimean War had not permanently solved the Eastern question. Among the divided and heterogeneous population subject to the Turk, there was almost perpetual unrest. In 1858 there were insurrectionary movements in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegrin troops crossed the frontier into the latter province. Moldavia and Wallachia were anxious to unite, but the powers, though assenting to their virtual independence, decreed that they must remain separate principalities. With great ingenuity, however, the two states cut the knot by electing the same ruler, Prince Alexander Cuza. Europe wisely accepted the accomplished fact, and in 1859 recognized the union of the two Romanic principalities under the title of Romania. In 1862, Servia expelled the Turkish garrisons, and in the same year the Greeks broke out into revolt, expelled King Otto, and offered their uneasy crown to Prince Alfred of England. But the protecting powers, England, France, and Russia, had pledged themselves not to allow any of their cadets to accept the throne, and in 1863 England obtained for the Greeks the services of a Danish prince, now King George, and at the same time presented him with the Ionian Isles. Crete was only kept quiet, 1866 to 1868, by the intervention of the powers, and in 1875 the whole Eastern question was again reopened by the outbreak of insurrection among the peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina, supported by volunteers from Servia and Montenegro. Whether that insurrection was spontaneous, or whether it was stimulated from St. Petersburg, is a question which it is not easy to decide. Russia was, at any rate, not sorry to have the opportunity of fishing again in troubled waters. It had been plain for some time past that Tsar Alexander did not intend to accept as final the results of the Crimean War. He had, as we have seen, taken advantage in 1870 of the preoccupation of Europe to denounce the Treaty of Paris in regard to the neutrality of the Black Sea, a neutrality which Disraeli declared to be the very basis and gist of the Treaty of Paris of 1856, the main object of the war, the great result, for the accomplishment of which this country and France and their allies made the vast sacrifices now so freely acknowledged. The insurrection of 1875 gave the Tsar a still larger opportunity. Turkey now had nearly 20 years of grace in which to put her house in order, but all the fair promises made in 1856 had gone to the winds. Admitted to the polite society of Europe by the Treaty of Paris, the Porte had continued to behave as a barbarian. The lot of the Christians was no whit better than before the Crimean War, and all unofficial classes groaned under the oppressiveness and uncertainty of a fiscal system which nevertheless starved the treasury. For it is one of the salutary paradoxes incidental to misgovernment that it is as ruinous to the sovereign as it is hurtful to the subject. The inherent extravagance of a bad system combined with the peculation of an army of officials to bring disaster upon Turkey, and in October 1875 the Sultan was compelled to inform his creditors that he could not pay the full interest on the debt. Partial repudiation complicated an international situation already sufficiently embarrassing. The three emperors took counsel together, and on December 30th, 1875, the Austrian Chancellor, Count Andrassy, issued from Budapest the note which bears his name. The Andrassy note expressed the anxiety of the powers to curtail the area of the insurrection and to maintain the peace of Europe. It drew attention to the failure of the Porte to carry out reforms long overdue, and it insisted that pressure must be put upon the Sultan effectually to redeem his promises. In particular, he must be pressed to grant complete religious liberty, to abolish tax farming, to apply the direct taxes locally levied in Bosnia and Herzegovina to the local needs of those provinces, to improve the condition of the rural population by multiplying peasant owners, and above all to appoint a special commission composed in equal numbers of Mussulmans and Christians to control the execution not only of the reforms now demanded by the powers, but also of those spontaneously promised by the Sultan in the decrees of October 2nd and December 12th. To this note the British government gave in their general adhesion, though they pointed out that the Sultan had, during the last few months, promised the more important of the reforms indicated therein. The note was accordingly presented to the Porte at the end of January 1876, and the Sultan, with almost suspicious promptitude, accepted 4 out of the 5 points, the exception being the application of the direct tax to local objects. The friendly efforts of the diplomatists were foiled, however, by the attitude of the insurgents. The latter refused, not unnaturally, to be satisfied with mere assurances, or to lay down their arms without substantial guarantees. The Sultan insisted again, not without reason, that it was impossible to initiate a scheme of reform while the provinces were actually in armed rebellion. Meanwhile the mischief was spreading. Bulgaria broke out into revolt in April. At the beginning of May a fanatical Mohammedan émeute at Salonika led to the murder of the French and German consuls. The Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed on May 30th, and on June 4th was found dead, having apparently committed suicide. More drastic measures were obviously necessary if a great European conflagration was to be avoided. On May 11th the Austrian and Russian chancellors were in conference with Prince Bismarck at Berlin, and determined to make further and more peremptory demands upon the Sultan. There was to be an immediate armistice of 2 months' duration, during which certain measures of pacification and repatriation were to be executed under the superintendence of the delegates of the powers. If by the expiry of the armistice the object of the powers had not been attained, diplomatic action would have to be reinforced. France and Italy assented to the note, but the British government regarded the terms as unduly peremptory. They resented the independent action of the 3 imperial powers and declined to be a party to the memorandum. Accordingly, the proposed intervention was abandoned. Mr. Disraeli's refusal created, as was inevitable, profound perturbation abroad, and evoked a storm of criticism at home. Out of the welter of charges and countercharges some points have now emerged with tolerable clearness. The European concert, whatever it was worth, was broken by the policy of Great Britain. Had the British Cabinet gone wholeheartedly with the other powers, irresistible pressure would have been put upon the Porte, and some terrible atrocities might perhaps have been averted. On the other hand, it is clear that the imperial chancellors were encouraged in an attitude which was almost insolent by the belief that England would never again commit the crime of the Crimean War. They presumed upon the pacific tendencies manifested by Great Britain in recent years, and were misled, much as the Tsar Nicholas was misled by the amiability of Lord Aberdeen. into the belief that Great Britain might be regarded as a quantité négligible in European diplomacy. If they sincerely desired the preservation of peace, they committed an inexcusable blunder in not inviting the cooperation of England before formulating the demands of the Berlin Memorandum. Events now moved rapidly. On May 24th, the government ordered the British fleet in the Mediterranean to sail for Bezika Bay. The disorder in Constantinople was in itself sufficient justification for this precaution, but by the Turks it was unhappily interpreted as an encouragement to defiance of the will of the continental powers, perhaps also as an indication that they might safely show themselves to be masters in their own house. They showed it in a characteristic fashion. Some disorders in Bulgaria led to terrible reprisals. A horde of irregular soldiery, the Bashi Bazouks, was let loose upon a half-armed peasantry, and all Europe was made to ring with an account of the atrocities committed in the name of the Ottoman Sultan. How much of exaggeration there was in the accounts published in England and elsewhere it was and is impossible to say, but something much less than the ascertained facts would be sufficient to make the historian avert his own eyes and those of his readers with all possible rapidity from a scene so terrible. In July, Mr. Walter Baring was sent out by the British government to Adrianople to ascertain, if possible, the truth. His final report was not issued until September, but preliminary reports so far substantiated the accounts which had been published in the English press as to move the conscience of England to its depths. In a dispatch to Sir Henry Elliot, British ambassador to the Porte, Lord Derby gave expression in language not less strong by reason of its restraint to the feelings of indignation aroused in England by the accounts of the Bulgarian atrocities, and instructed him to demand from the Sultan prompt and effective reparation for the victims. But a voice more powerful than that of Lord Derby was already making articulate the feelings of his countrymen. To Mr. Gladstone the tale of atrocities made an irresistible appeal. A pamphlet published on September 6 was circulated by tens of thousands. *The Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East. With voice and pen he vehemently demanded that the Turks should be cleared out, bag and baggage, from the province they have desolated and profaned. Long before this, however, another complication had arisen. In June, Servia and Montenegro had declared war upon the Porte. How far would that conflict extend? Could it be confined within the original limits? These were the serious questions with which diplomacy was now confronted. The Servian army consisted largely of Russian volunteers, and was commanded by a Russian general. How long would it be before the Russian government became a party to the quarrel? The Servian army, even reinforced by the volunteers, could offer but feeble resistance to the Turk, and in August Prince Milan, acting on a hint from England, asked for the mediation of the powers. England thereupon urged the Sultan to come to terms with Servia and Montenegro, lest a worse thing should befall him. The Sultan, however, declined an armistice, but formulated his terms and intimated that if the powers approved them he would grant an immediate suspension of hostilities. But to Lord Derby's chagrin, Servia would accept nothing less than an armistice, and after 6 weeks' suspension hostilities recommenced. Nevertheless, Lord Derby was untiring in his efforts to promote a pacification, and suggested, September 21st, to the powers some heads of proposals: the status quo in Servia and Montenegro, local or administrative autonomy for Bosnia and Herzegovina, guarantees against maladministration in Bulgaria, and a comprehensive scheme of reform, all to be embodied in a protocol concluded between the Porte and the powers. Russia then proposed, September 26th, that in the event of a refusal from Turkey, the Allied fleets should enter the Bosphorus, that Bosnia should be temporarily occupied by Austria, Bulgaria by Russia. Turkey thereupon suggested an armistice of 6 months. Russia demurred, and eventually 6 weeks was agreed upon. Lord Derby was determined that the breathing space should be utilized for one more effort to preserve the peace of Europe. At his suggestion a conference met in Constantinople in December, and Lord Salisbury attended it as the chief representative of Great Britain. The Powers agreed to the terms suggested by Lord Derby in September, but the Porte was obdurate. Profuse in his professions and promises of reform, the Porte stubbornly refused to allow Europe to superintend their execution. General Ignatieff, the Russian delegate, thereupon withdrew from the conference, and Russia proceeded to mobilize her troops. Diplomacy, however, made one more effort to preserve peace. On March 31st, 1877, the Powers signed in London a protocol put forward by Count Shuvalov. Taking cognizance of the Turkish promises of reform, the Powers declared their intention of watching carefully the manner in which the promises of the Ottoman government are carried into effect. If, however, the condition of the Christian subjects of the Porte should again lead to a return of the complications which periodically disturb the peace of the East, they think it right to declare that such a state of things would be incompatible with their interests and those of Europe in general. The Turk in high dudgeon rejected the protocol April 10th, and on April 24th Russia declared war. Single-handed, the Tsar intended to extort by force of arms those guarantees which the Sultan had refused to the collective demand of Europe. Russia, it must be confessed, had behaved in face of prolonged provocation with considerable patience and restraint, and had shown a commendable desire to maintain the European concert. The Turk had exhibited throughout his usual mixture of shrewdness and obstinacy. It is difficult to believe that he would have maintained his obstinate front but for expectations based upon the supposed goodwill of the British Government. The language of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary had unquestionably given him some encouragement, so much so that before the break-up of the conference Lord Salisbury telegraphed to Lord Derby from Constantinople: "The Grand Vizier believes that he can count upon the assistance of Lord Derby and Lord Beaconsfield. The Turk, it is true, is an adept at diplomatic bluff, and assistance went beyond the facts. But this much is certain: if the English Cabinet had, even in January 1877, frankly and unambiguously gone hand in hand with Russia, there would have been no war." The details of the campaign must not detain us. Suffice it to say that for Russia it was no mere military parade. The Russian army crossed the Danube in June, and it was many months before their main army could pierce the Balkans. In their path was the great fortress of Plevna, and for 5 months Osman Pasha resisted all the efforts made by the Russians to capture it. At last, on December 10th, Plevna surrendered to General Todleben. Before the end of January 1878, the Russian army reached Adrianople, and in February Constantinople itself was threatened. A basis of agreement had already been reached at Adrianople, January 31st. The terms were now embodied in a treaty signed on March 3rd at a village not far from Constantinople. Montenegro, Servia, and Romania were to be recognized definitely as independent of the Porte, and certain frontier districts were to be ceded to them. The reforms recommended to the Porte at the Conference of Constantinople were to be immediately introduced into Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Danubian fortresses to be razed, reforms were to be granted to the Armenians, Russia was to acquire, in lieu of the greater part of the money indemnity which she claimed, Batum, Kars, and other territory in Asia, and certain districts on the Romanian frontier to be exchanged with Romania for the strip of Bessarabia retroceded in 1856. But the most striking feature of the treaty was the creation of a Greater Bulgaria, which was to be constituted an autonomous tributary principality with a Christian government and a national militia, and was to extend from the Danube to the Aegean Sea, nearly as far south as Medea on the Black Sea, Adrianople and Salonika, and to include on the west the district round Monastir. Bulgaria would thus have comprised more than half of the Balkan peninsula. These terms excited alarm and jealousy in Greece and in the Balkan States. How were they regarded by Europe in general and Great Britain in particular? Ever since the outbreak of the Russo-Turkish War, the British government had watched with deepening anxiety the development of events in Eastern Europe. Mr. Gladstone indeed identified the cause of Russia with the cause of freedom and justice, but among statesmen he stood almost alone. The government declared their policy to be one of rigid neutrality so long as Egypt, the Suez Canal, and Constantinople were not threatened, and when that policy was formally challenged by Mr. Gladstone, their majority rose far above their normal figure to 131. If the Cabinet were not wholly united at this moment, neither were the opposition leaders. Mr. Gladstone's vehemence on the Eastern question strained severely the loyalty of his late colleagues. "I feel certain," wrote Lord Hartington to Lord Granville, "that the Whigs and moderate Liberals in the House are a good deal disgusted, and I am much afraid that if he goes on much further, nothing can prevent a break-up of the party." His opponents were not much better off. In private conversation, Mr. Disraeli gave a humorous account of the 6 parties in the Cabinet. The first party is that which is for immediate war with Russia. The second party is for war to save Constantinople. The third party is the party of peace at any price. The fourth party would let the Russians take Constantinople and would then turn them out. The fifth party desires to plant the cross on the dome of St. Sophia. And then there are the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who desire to see something done, but don't know exactly what. The Russian victories at the end of 1877 deepened anxieties and accentuated differences. In January 1878, Lord Derby warned Russia that an occupation of the Dardanelles by her army would endanger the good relations between herself and Great Britain, and 3 days afterwards thought it necessary to remind her that any treaty concluded between Turkey and Russia which affected the engagements of 1856 and 1878 would not be valid without the assent of the powers who were parties of those treaties. January 14th. Parliament, called together at an ominously early date, January 17th, was informed by the Queen that should hostilities be unfortunately prolonged, some unexpected occurrence may render it incumbent on me to adopt measures of precaution. It was soon apparent what was in the mind of ministers. Northcote gave notice that they would ask the House for an additional £6 million for armaments, and on January 23rd the fleet was ordered to sail for the Dardanelles. Upon the public announcement of this menacing step, Lord Carnarvon and Lord Derby resigned. The former was succeeded at the Colonial Office by Sir Michael Hicks Beach. The latter withdrew his resignation when the fleet was recalled to Pazika Bay. On January 28th, Northcote, in moving the vote, made public the terms demanded by Russia, which, in addition to the points subsequently embodied in the Treaty of San Stefano, included an ulterior understanding for safeguarding the rights and interests of Russia in the Straits. This was the point in regard to which she had already been warned by Lord Derby, and the situation became critical in the extreme. In the preliminary terms signed between the combatants on January 31st, this stipulation disappeared, but in consequence of excited telegrams from Mr. Layard, the British ambassador in Constantinople, the Cabinet decided, February 7th, to send a detachment of the fleet into the Sea of Marmara for the protection of British subjects in Constantinople. Russia retorted that if British ships sailed up the Straits, Russian troops would enter Constantinople for the purpose of similarly protecting the lives of Christians of every race. The Sultan, however, withdrew the leave necessary to enable ships of war to pass the Dardanelles. On March 3rd, tension was relieved by the signature of the Treaty of San Stefano, but only for the moment. The Austrian government had been moving in the matter of a European Congress, and on March 4th Lord Derby informed Count Beust that Great Britain agreed to the suggestion, provided it was clearly understood that all questions dealt with in the Treaty of Peace between Russia and Turkey should be considered as subjects to be discussed in the Congress. This had been throughout the keynote of our policy, the diapason of our diplomacy. With regard to the Treaty of San Stefano, the language of Lord Beaconsfield was emphatic. It abolishes the dominion of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. It creates a large state which, under the name of Bulgaria, is inhabited by many races not Bulgarian, and all the European dominions of the Ottoman Porte are put under the administration of Russia. The effect of all the stipulations combined will be to make the Black Sea as much of a Russian lake as the Caspian. Whether this description was exaggerated or no, there can be no question that in every clause the treaty was a deviation from those of 1856 and 1871, and as such required the assent of the signatory powers. To the demand that the treaty in its entirety should be submitted to a Congress, Russia demurred. Great Britain insisted. Again things looked like war. Lord Derby, the most pacific member of the Cabinet, resigned March 28th. On April 1st, Lord Beaconsfield announced that Parliament would be asked to authorize the calling out of the reserves, and on April 2nd, Lord Salisbury, the new Foreign Secretary, issued a masterly memorandum placing before the powers the case of Great Britain. Peace hung in the balance. Apart from the dispute between England and Russia, there was a great deal of inflammable material about to which a match would set light. Greece, Servia, and Roumania were all gravely dissatisfied with the terms of the Treaty of San Stefano. Greece had actually invaded Thessaly at the beginning of February, and had only consented to abstain from further hostilities upon the assurance of the powers that her claims should have favourable consideration in the definitive treaty of peace. Parliament adjourned for the Easter recess on April 16th, reassured as to the prospects of peace by a speech from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. On the following morning, the Times made the sensational announcement that Lord Beaconsfield had ordered 7,000 Indian troops to embark for Malta. That the coup was dramatic, none will dispute, but it has been variously judged. The disciples of Disraeli contended that it revealed as by a flashlight the resources upon which England could draw, and thus powerfully contributed to the maintenance of peace. His enemies declared that it smacked of transpontine melodrama rather than of the sober traditions of English statesmanship. Mr. Gladstone impeached the policy as gravely unconstitutional. Lord Selborne declared it to be illegal. The historical critic must admit that the move was consistent with the whole trend of Lord Beaconsfield's policy, and must insist that if it alarmed England, it impressed Europe, and that it made for peace. Before the end of May, the Indian troops began to arrive at Malta. On the 30th, Lord Salisbury and Count Schuvaloff came to an agreement on the main points at issue, and on June 13th the Congress opened at Berlin. Prince Bismarck, of course, presided. The English plenipotentiaries were the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary. The Congress marked the zenith of one of the most remarkable careers in English parliamentary history. Lord Beaconsfield figured for a moment as the dictator of Europe. Der alte Jude, das ist der Mann. Such was Bismarck's pregnant summary of the situation. The day after the Congress met, the world was informed, through the fraud of a Foreign Office clerk, of all the details of the convention concluded between Lord Salisbury and Count Schuvaloff on May 30th. The critics of the government pointed to this as one more instance of the shameless duplicity of English diplomacy at this juncture. The Congress, after all, was a hollow sham, and much to the like effect. Reflection will surely reverse such contemporary criticism. No prudent diplomatist would go into open Congress without a clear understanding on the main points with his principal antagonist. Lord Beaconsfield and Lord Salisbury had not omitted this wise precaution, though insufficient care had been exercised in preserving official secrecy. They had taken also another precaution not prematurely disclosed. By a convention dated June 4th, They had agreed with Turkey that so long as Russia retained Kars and other recent conquests in Armenia, the island of Cyprus was to be occupied and administered by Great Britain. Turkey was to receive the surplus revenues of the island to carry out reforms in her Asiatic dominions and to be protected in them by Great Britain. The Treaty of Berlin was signed on July 13th. The great point on which it differed from the Treaty of San Stefano was in regard to Greater Bulgaria. Bulgaria, as defined at Berlin, was not more than a third of the Bulgaria mapped out at San Stefano. It was to consist of a relatively narrow strip between the Danube and the Balkans, and to be an independent state under Turkish suzerainty. South of it there was to be a province, Eastern Roumelia, which was to be restored to the Sultan, who agreed to place it under a Christian governor, approved by the Powers. By this change the Sultan recovered 2,500,000 of population and 30,000 square miles of territory. Bosnia and Herzegovina were handed over to Austrian occupation, an occupation which has proved to be permanent. The Greeks obtained, but not until 1881, an unimportant rectification of their northern frontier. For the rest, the terms of San Stefano were confirmed. The essential differences between the two treaties consisted in the aggrandizement of Austria-Hungary and the partition of Greater Bulgaria. The latter arrangement was not permanent. In 1885, Prince Alexander of Battenberg, who had accepted in 1879 the Principality of Bulgaria, yielded to the clearly expressed will of the people and agreed to the union of the two Bulgarias. The diplomatic position was now entirely reversed. Russia was indignant. Great Britain not merely acquiescent, but approving. The explanation is simple. Russia had played her cards in Bulgaria as badly as they could be played. In opposition to her high-handed and self-seeking methods, there had grown up a strong national party. The Greater Bulgaria of 1878 would have been a Russian province, within striking distance of Constantinople. The Bulgaria of 1885 was, as Lord Salisbury, again in office, clearly perceived, a sure bulwark against Russia. If, wrote Sir Robert Morier to Sir William White, you can help to build up these people into a bulwark of independent states and thus screen the sick man from the fury of the northern blast, for God's sake do it. With Lord Salisbury's help, Sir William White did it, and thus, in Morier's words, a state has been evolved out of the protoplasm of Balkan chaos. It is fair to remember that but for Lord Beaconsfield's action in 1878, that evolution would have been impossible. On July 16th, the British ministers returned from Berlin and were received with the wildest acclamations by the London crowd. Lord Beaconsfield clearly interpreted the feelings of London, if not of England, when he declared in historic phrase that he had brought back peace with honour. Peace was indubitable, as to honour opinion was divided. The envoys received the Order of the Garter from their sovereign, and the freedom of the city from the merchants and bankers of the capital, but the public voice was not unanimous in the endorsement of these honours. The history of the Eastern question, between 1875 and 1878, raises many difficult problems in political ethics. The first and broadest is the general right of intervention in the internal concerns of sovereign states. In opposition to the Holy Allies, Lord Castlereagh had laid down the sound principle that with the internal affairs of each separate state we have nothing to do. His protest was addressed to absolute monarchs, and it is worth recalling in order to remind impatient philanthropists that intervention is necessarily a double-edged weapon. Employed in the defense of oppressed nationalities today, it may be used tomorrow in the interests of autocracy. The only safe rule is clearly that of Lord Castlereagh. But no rule is without exceptions, more especially in politics. Did the condition of the Ottoman dominions in 1875 provide one? It is impossible to dismiss lightly the argument put forward by Mr. Gladstone in 1876 through 1878, and by the Duke of Argyll in 1896. In the latter year they were the only two survivors of the cabinet which waged the Crimean War. That war, its conduct and its issue, had, in their view, imposed upon Great Britain a peculiar responsibility in regard to the government of the Turk in general, and in particular his treatment of his Christian subjects. That responsibility will hardly be denied, but its existence does not determine the manner and time of fulfilling it. Nor must it blind us to another truth of equal weight. "We support Turkey," said Lord Palmerston in 1853, "for our own sake and for our own interests." The policy of Great Britain from first to last has been that of protecting Turkey with a view to the repulse of Russia from an exclusive and dangerous dominion over the east of Europe. But the buffer consisted, after all, of human beings, and to their well-being we could not be indifferent. One cardinal mistake Lord Beaconsfield had made, that of separating Great Britain from the other powers in the Berlin Memorandum. That separation led, though not immediately, to the single-handed intervention of Russia. But that intervention rendered it absolutely essential that in any general settlement the influence of Great Britain should be decisively exercised. The treaty which closed this chapter of the Eastern question may not have been ideal. It was not destined to be final. But this at least may be said of it: it did not leave the cat's paw of Russia within striking distance of Constantinople. The treaty torn up by Lord Beaconsfield did. Whether the difference between them was worth the risk of a European war is a question which posterity must decide. End of Section 46. Section 47 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 24. Afghanistan and South Africa, 1878 to 1880, Part 1. It is the fashion to deny that history ever repeats itself. Such denials are confronted with an awkward illustration in Afghanistan. The story to be discussed in this chapter repeats with singular precision the experience of the preceding generation, with one characteristic and suggestive difference. The intertwining of events in Europe and Asia is much more intricate than was the case 40 years earlier. On the day when the diplomatists met in Congress at Berlin, June 13, 1878, the Amir of Afghanistan learnt at Kabul that a Russian mission was on its way to his capital. A week after Lord Beaconsfield returned to London, bringing back peace with honor from Berlin, General Stoletov, in command of the Russian mission, reached Kabul and was received with every possible mark of distinction by Sher Ali, July 22nd. English diplomacy had headed off Russia from the Dardanelles. Was Russian diplomacy going to take its revenge on the Khyber? The disastrous events of the early 40s had made, naturally enough, a profound impression upon British policy in India. Successive governments had pursued since then a consistent policy of masterly inactivity in Central Asia. Russia employed the opportunity for steady, though stealthy, advance. Dost Muhammad did not understand the policy of masterly inactivity. Again and again he pressed Sir John Lawrence, 1863 through 1869, to take under the protection of the British government his designated heir, Sher Ali. Lawrence persistently declined to interfere in the domestic politics of Afghanistan. By 1868, however, Sher Ali, without British assistance, had made himself master of his brethren and of the wild tribes who had owned his father's sway. Lawrence thereupon recognized the de facto ruler and sent him a congratulatory message and a present of money and arms. The Amir did not fail to perceive that these compliments coincided with the capture of Samarkand by Russia in 1868. The Russian advance in Central Asia was now giving some uneasiness to Great Britain, and in January 1873 the frontiers between the two powers in Asia were formally defined by treaty. The ink was hardly dry upon the treaty when the news arrived that Russia had occupied Khiva, June 1873. Count Shuvaloff assured the British Government that the occupation was a purely temporary expedient, but the moment of evacuation had not yet arrived. At Khiva, Russia was within 400 miles of the northwestern frontier of British India. By this time Lawrence had given place to Lord Mayo, and Mayo, struck down by the hand of a fanatic, had been succeeded by Lord Northbrook. On the eve of his departure from India, 1869, Lawrence indited a despatch which indicates, not obscurely, some change of policy, advised a clear understanding with the Court of St. Petersburg as to its projects and designs in Central Asia, and that it might be given to understand in firm and courteous language that it cannot be permitted to interfere in the affairs of Afghanistan or in those of any state which lies contiguous to our frontier. Such an intimation to Russia was clearly inconsistent with the policy of masterly inactivity to which Lawrence had throughout his long tenure of office adhered, but that policy still dominated the Council in Whitehall. Sher Ali was at least as much alarmed by the approach of Russia as was Lawrence, but he could get no effective assurance of support from Lord Mayo, still less from Lord Northbrook. In 1873, when the Russians were actually marching on Khiva, Sher Ali tried to persuade the Viceroy that the interests of the Afghan and English governments are identical, and that the border of Afghanistan is in truth the border of India. Northbrook, obviously perturbed, telegraphed home for instructions. The reply is historic. Cabinet thinks you should inform Amir we do not at all share his alarm and consider there is no cause for it, but you may assure him we shall maintain our settled policy in favor of Afghanistan if he abides by our advice in external affairs. This was one of the clear cases where telegraphy has proved a curse to the government of India. Lord Northbrook obeyed his instructions to the letter. The Emir got 20,000 rifles and a large present of money. He did not get the assurance he wanted. The year 1873 marks, as has been truly said, a fatal turning point in Anglo-Afghan relations. Northbrook's refusal turned Sher Ali from a friend into an enemy, and he decided, as his father had done 40 years before, to throw in his lot with Russia. In 1874 a new government came into power. The boot was now on the other foot. Lord Salisbury was anxious to induce the Amir to accept a British resident. Lord Lytton, who succeeded Lord Northbrook as Viceroy in 1876, endeavoured to persuade him to accept a comprehensive treaty, but in vain. The Amir, repulsed by one Viceroy after another, had made up his mind to look for support in another direction. Meanwhile, the British Government concluded with the Khan of Kalat in Balochistan the important Treaty of Jacobabad, December 1876, a treaty which gave us the right of garrisoning Quetta, a position which turns the flank of the Afghan frontier, opposed to India, along the mountain across the Indus. This diplomatic success alarmed the Amir, but not sufficiently to induce him to receive a British resident. The reception of the Russian mission in 1878 compelled Lord Lytton to immediate and decisive action, though the opportune conclusion of the Treaty of Berlin led to amended instructions to the Russian envoy. General Stolotov was bidden not to go generally as far as would have been advisable if war with England had been threatened. Such instructions, however, could not, even had they been known, affect the policy of Great Britain. Lord Lytton took the only possible step in announcing to the Amir that a British envoy of high rank, Sir Neville Chamberlain, would proceed to Kabul forthwith. The mission, with an escort of about 1,000 men, left Peshawar on September 21st. Sir Neville took the precaution of sending forward Major Cavagnari to demand leave for the mission to proceed. Leave was refused. It was made clear to General Chamberlain that he would encounter armed resistance, and the mission was disbanded. Nothing, as Chamberlain wrote, could have been more humiliating to the British Crown and nation. To the refusal to receive an envoy from the Queen Empress, at a moment, moreover, when a Russian mission was actually in Kabul, there could be but one answer. A large force was mobilized for the invasion of Afghanistan, but before it marched, an ultimatum was sent to Sher Ali to demand a full and immediate apology and the reception of a permanent embassy in Afghanistan. On November 21st, the force, 30,000 to 40,000 strong, advanced in 3 columns, one by the Khyber Pass under the command of Sir Samuel Brown, another through the Kuram Valley under Major General Roberts, the third under Sir Donald Stewart was to advance through the Bolan Pass on Kandahar. Before the end of December, Brown had reached Jalalabad, Roberts had fought his way through the Shutargarden Pass, and in January Stewart entered Kandahar. Sher Ali, realizing the hopelessness of resistance, fled into Turkestan, with such members of the Russian mission as lingered at Kabul, and there in February 1879 he died. His son, Yaqub Khan, established himself in Kabul. In May, he presented himself to General Brown's camp at Kandamak, and terms of peace were quickly arranged. By the Treaty of Kandamak, Yaqub Khan agreed to receive a permanent British embassy with a suitable escort at Kabul, to conduct his foreign policy under the advice of Great Britain, to give facilities for trade, and to allow such a rectification of the northwestern frontier as was demanded by the scientific school of British strategists. In return, he was to be supported against external aggression, and to receive an annual subsidy of 6 lakhs of rupees. The news of the conclusion of peace was received with much satisfaction in England, and the government congratulated itself and the country on the attainment of a scientific frontier. Lord Lawrence's warnings were ignored, the advocates of the forward policy triumphed, the Indian frontier was to rest not upon the Indus but upon the command of the passes. One of the great soldiers who had made the war had forebodings about the peace. General Roberts thought that peace had been signed too quickly, and that it ought to have been dictated in Kabul. The forebodings were only too sadly justified. Sir Louis Cavagnari, whose diplomatic tact had done so much to smooth the negotiations at Kandamak, accepted the mission to Kabul. Taking with him only a small escort, he reached the capital in July. In September, he and all his comrades were murdered by the Amir's mutinous soldiery. The news reached Simla on September 4th, and 2 days later Roberts left to take command of the Kabul field force. Stewart's army had hardly left Kandahar, which was at once reoccupied. Roberts and his little force reached Kabul early in October. Yaqub promptly abdicated and was deported to India. Efforts were made to discover Cavagnari's murderers, and the city and district around it were placed under martial law. Roberts found Kabul much more Russian than English, the officers arrayed in uniforms of Russian pattern, Russian money in the treasury, and Russian wares in the bazaars. Before he left, he brought to light much evidence as to Russian designs in Afghanistan, and he placed it on formal record that, in his opinion, the recent rupture with Sher Ali had been the means of unmasking and checking a very serious conspiracy against the peace and security of our Indian Empire. Meanwhile, his own position in Kabul was far from secure. Again and again he had to beat off the tribesmen, and not until the end of December did reinforcements reach him from India. Early in May of 1880, Stewart and his division, after a successful engagement at Ahmed Khel near Ghazni, joined him at Kabul. Before this, an important political decision had been arrived at. To retain Afghanistan was out of the question, how could it best be made to contribute to the tranquillity of the northern frontier of India? There were only two alternatives: to erect Afghanistan into a strong, united, and friendly buffer state, or to break it up and so render it impotent for mischief. Could the friendship of the tribesmen or of their ruler be really assured, the former was the obvious policy. But the tribesmen were hostile, and a ruler was still to seek. Lord Lytton decided, therefore, on the policy of disintegration. Kandahar, or Western Afghanistan, was promised to Sher Ali, a cousin of the late Amir, but Sher Ali declared truly enough that he could hold it only with the help of British troops. Northern Afghanistan was still unprovided for. Opportunely at this moment there appeared upon the scene the strong man so badly needed. A grandson of Dost Mohammed, Abdur Rahman had been for some time a semi-captive pensioner of Russia in Turkestan. He no sooner reappeared than the tribesmen rallied round him, and Lord Lytton offered to make him Amir of Kabul. But Abdur Rahman wanted to be Amir, not of Kabul, but of Afghanistan. He had not long to wait for the realization of his ambition. The new Amir had just been installed in Kabul, July 22nd, 1880, and the British preparations for evacuation were all but complete when a new danger arose. Ayub Khan, a brother of the late Amir Yaqub, gathered round him a large force of tribesmen in the Herat district, and announcing himself as a candidate for the throne, marched on Kandahar. General Primrose, left in command at Kandahar, sent out a brigade under Brigadier General Burrows to stop him. With a totally inadequate force, Burrows did his best to carry out his orders, but at Maiwand on July 27th his brigade was cut to pieces by a force overwhelmingly superior, and only a remnant got back to Kandahar. Primrose and his force in Kandahar were now in imminent danger. Kandahar itself was invested by the forces of Ayub Khan, flushed with recent victory. A notable resolution was now taken by the two great soldiers at Kabul. The government was inclined to attempt the relief of Kandahar from Quetta. Stewart and Roberts, with their ultimate approval, decided to do it from Kabul. Roberts, with 10,000 picked men, was to succour Kandahar. Stewart was to lead back the rest of the Kabul garrison to India. On August 9th, Roberts' famous march began. By the 31st he had covered the 318 miles of country that separate Kabul from Kandahar. On September 1st his triumph was confirmed and consummated by a brilliant victory over the Afghan forces outside Kandahar. Ayub's army was annihilated, and his political pretensions were destroyed. Roberts became the idol of the army and of his countrymen. The Afghan war was at an end. Even Lord Lytton shrank from the task of a permanent occupation of northern and central Afghanistan. But the disposition of events no longer rested with that brilliant though unlucky Viceroy. On the defeat of the Conservative party at the polls, April 1880, he at once tendered his resignation, and it was accepted. Lord Hartington reigned in Whitehall, Lord Ripon at Calcutta. The new government, despite strong protest from the Queen, determined upon a complete and immediate reversal of the policy of their predecessors. On one point only was there momentary hesitation. Lord Ripon himself realized the difficulty of abandoning Kandahar. Roberts regarded its retention as of vital importance. All the soldiers in India and most of the civilians were with him. The Queen ardently supported his views at home, but there were strong arguments on the other side. Sher Ali proved himself to be a weak creature, incapable of maintaining the position in which we had placed him without our help. Abdur Rahman regarded Kandahar as essential to his hold on Herat. To retain it meant friction with the Amir, hostility with the tribesmen, perhaps war with both. Lord Hartington, though not without grave consideration, decided that as soon as it could be done with dignity and safety, Kandahar must be evacuated. Lord Ripon was brought round to the view that the retention of Quetta would give us all the strategic advantage we could desire without the certain expense and possible danger of garrisoning Kandahar. Quetta was retained, and in April 1881 the evacuation of Kandahar was completed. Thus the Treaty of Gandamak was torn up, and Abdur Rahman ruled over a friendly, strong, and independent Afghanistan. The policy of disintegration was repudiated, and we reverted to that of a buffer state. Thanks to the timely emergence of a strong and exceptionally sagacious ruler, that policy relieved us of danger, though not of anxiety, for 20 years. Afghanistan was not the only problem bequeathed by the Beaconsfield Cabinet to their successors. The forward policy had been adopted in other parts of the world, and nowhere with more significant results than in South Africa. On April 12, 1877, Sir Theophilus Shepstone, acting in accordance with the discretion allowed him by Lord Carnarvon, proclaimed the annexation of the Transvaal to the British Crown. This history has hitherto been silent as to the progress of British rule in South Africa, and the omission must now be repaired. From the middle of the 17th century down to the close of the 18th, Cape Colony was a dependency of the Dutch East India Company, being utilized by their ships as a port of call and by their sailors as a vegetable garden. In 1795, the United Provinces became a dependency of the French Republic, and to save the Cape Colony from a similar fate, it was occupied by a British force. Handed back to the Batavian Republic in 1802, it was reconquered by England in 1806, and at the Peace of Paris, 1814, it was purchased for £6 million from the Dutch government and became the property of Great Britain. But though the government was British, the white inhabitants were mainly Dutch. Not until after 1820 was there any considerable emigration from this country. Between the British government, progressive in policy, and the Dutch farmers, strongly conservative in instinct, causes of friction rapidly developed, notably in regard to the treatment of the natives. The zeal of the English government and of the English missionaries was perhaps more obvious than their discretion, and with the enforcement of the Act for the abolition of slavery, the cup of Dutch indignation overflowed. That Act was administered with flagrant disregard for the interests of the Dutch farmers and with scant respect for their vested rights. They consequently determined to shake off the dust of the British government from their feet and to seek freedom in the vast hinterland of South Africa. This was the meaning of the Great Boer Trek, 1836 to 1840, the cardinal fact of South African history, and a story in some respects curiously romantic and pathetic. The ultimate result of the Great Trek was the establishment of two Boer states, virtually independent, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Meanwhile, a handful of English colonists had established themselves at Port Natal, 1824, but the Boers from the north and west of the Drakensberg range threatened their existence, and in the early 40s it seemed probable that a third Boer state would be established between the Drakensberg and the sea. In 1843, however, Natal was formally proclaimed to be a British colony, and the Boers, after a brief struggle, sullenly withdrew to the west of Drakensberg. Down to 1856, Natal was regarded as forming part of Cape Colony, but in that year it was declared independent, and it attained to the full dignity of responsible government in 1893. What were the relations between Cape Colony and the Boer states to the north? From the moment of the Trek, there were two possible alternatives open to the British government, either frankly to recognize the secession of the Boers and in due time to acknowledge the existence of European states in South Africa independent of the British flag, or to make it clear from the outset that no other power would be tolerated in South Africa, and that the Boer farmers, go where they would, must remain subject to the English crown. For either policy there was something to be said. Unfortunately for the credit of British rule in South Africa, we adopted neither, or rather we adopted both. Thus, in 1848, Sir Harry Smith, the English governor of Cape Colony, issued a proclamation to the effect that the whole territory between the Orange and the Vaal rivers, as far east as the Drakensberg, was to be under the sovereignty of the Queen. The Dutch farmers under Pretorius protested against this assumption of sovereignty, but they were worsted in battle at Boomplatz, August 29th, 1848. Some of them fled to the north of the Vaal, the rest acquiesced with no good grace, and accepted the authority of the Queen and the Orange River sovereignty. The home government was lukewarm in its support of Sir Harry Smith. In 1851 the whole force of Cape Colony was engaged in one of the perennial struggles with the Kaffirs on the eastern frontier of the colony, and Pretorius, then an outlaw beyond the Vaal, threatened to raise an insurrection in the Orange sovereignty unless the independence of his countrymen to the north of the Vaal were recognized. Consequently, in 1852, the Sand River Convention was concluded. Great Britain thereby conceded to the emigrant farmers beyond the Vaal River the right to manage their own affairs and to govern themselves without any interference on the part of Her Majesty the Queen's government. Thus the South African or Transvaal Republic came into being as an independent state, but with two reservations. It was to be open to all comers on equal terms, and no slavery was to be permitted or practiced. Meanwhile, we were involved in troubles with the Basutos, the natives to the east of the Orange River sovereignty, and at the close of the war, General Cathcart, the officer in command, reported that it would be necessary to station 2,000 troops permanently in the sovereignty. The home government were in no mind for the assumption of further military responsibilities, and preferred the alternative of withdrawal. The Bloemfontein Convention was a counterpart of that concluded 2 years earlier with the Transvaal Boers. Thus the Orange Free State took its place side by side with the South African Republic, and it seemed as though a definite boundary were to be set to British sovereignty toward the northwest. For nearly 20 years the policy of non-intervention was consistently maintained. Meanwhile the Cape Colony itself advanced steadily toward the goal of self-government. During the vigorous and enlightened administration of Sir George Grey, 1854 to 1861, Cape Colony was endowed with an elected legislature and attained to responsible government in 1872. But Sir George Grey had a far wider vision than that bounded by the horizon of responsible government. Looking beyond the vacillating policy hitherto pursued by Great Britain in South Africa, he saw that the only possible path of safety lay in some form of federation. The State Paper in which in 1858 he submitted his views to the home government is one of the ablest documents in the history of our colonial empire. Grey had the support of the Boers of the Orange River sovereignty. Their Volksraad resolved in 1858 that a union or alliance with the Cape Colony, either on the plan of federation or otherwise, is desirable. But the only reply of the Colonial Office was to recall Grey for exceeding his instructions. He was restored by the personal intervention of the Queen, but he returned to Cape Town with a tarnished prestige and with gravely impaired authority. Had the home government grasped the problem as Sir George Grey grasped it, had they even had the sense to trust the man on the spot, the whole subsequent course of South African history might have been different. Mr. F. W. Reitz, the Transvaal Secretary of State in 1899, wrote to Sir George Grey in 1893, "Had British ministers in time past been wise enough to follow your advice, there would undoubtedly be today a British dominion extending from Table Bay to Zambesi." But the weary Titan was tired of the whole burden of colonial establishments, and was looking forward to the happy day when those wretched colonies would no longer hang like a millstone round our necks. Responsibilities once assumed are not, however, so lightly shaken off. Towards the end of the 60s, the period of masterly inactivity was drawing to a close in South Africa as in India. In 1868, the Boers on the Orange River became involved in a dispute with the Basutos to the east of them. the Basuto chief addressed a prayer to the British government, "Let me and my people rest under the large folds of the flag of England." His prayer was heard, and in 1869 British sovereignty was proclaimed over Basutoland. In 1871 Griqualand West, a native territory to the west of the Orange State, was similarly annexed to the Crown. This important acquisition gave us the diamond fields of the Kimberley district. But the importance was not measured only in diamonds. The annexation meant a new turn to the wheel of policy, the definite abandonment of the laissez-faire attitude which for the last 30 years had been characteristic of British policy in South Africa as elsewhere. The acquisition of the Kimberley diamond field meant also a new strain in the social life of South Africa. The digger, the capitalist, the company promoter jostled the slow-moving Dutch farmer and quickened the pace of life. Such was the condition of affairs in South Africa when, in 1874, Lord Carnarvon took up the reins at the Colonial Office. Lord Carnarvon was the minister who had been officially responsible for the enactment of a federal constitution for British North America, and he was anxious to confer a similar boon upon South Africa. The moment appeared not inopportune, for in 1872 a Federation Commission had been appointed in Cape Colony. But Cape Colony was in the first flush of self-satisfaction at the attainment of responsible government and had no leisure for the larger problem. Nevertheless, Lord Carnarvon wrote to the Governor of the Cape in 1875 to propose that the several states of South Africa should be invited to a conference to discuss native policy and other points of common interest, and to ventilate the all-important question of a possible union of South Africa in some form of confederation. The proposal was not welcomed in Cape Colony, and Mr. Froude, the eminent historian, who had been sent out to represent the Colonial Office at the proposed conference, found his position highly embarrassing both to himself and to his hosts. Froude put his finger with great acuteness upon the root difficulty. If we can make up our minds to allow the colonists to manage the natives their own way, we may safely confederate the whole country. Of federation, however, imposed upon them from London, the colonists would hear nothing. The conference in South Africa never met. Lord Carnarvon, not to be foiled, invited various gentlemen interested in South Africa to confer with him at the Colonial Office, August 1876. The Cape Premier, Mr. Molteno, happened to be in London, but was forbidden to attend. No delegate was present from the Transvaal, and Mr. Brand, President of the Orange Free State, who greatly impressed Froude, attended under strict injunctions from his Volksraad not to take part in any negotiation respecting federation by which the independence of his own state could be endangered. Sir Theophilus Shepstone and 2 members of the legislature represented Natal. As regards federation, the meeting was entirely abortive. Despite this discouragement, Lord Carnarvon sent out to South Africa in December 1876 the draft of a permissive confederation bill, which in the session of 1877 was passed into law by the Imperial Legislature. This enabling act contained the outline of a complete federal constitution. It was for the South African colonies to fill it in if they would. Lord Carnarvon, while insisting that the action of all parties, whether in the British colonies or the Dutch states, must be spontaneous and uncontrolled, informed the new Governor of the Cape that he had been selected to carry my scheme of confederation into effect. The man chosen for this high task was one of the most trusted and experienced servants of the Crown, one to whose life work the Confederation of South Africa might form an appropriate and noble crown. It was the expressed hope of his chief that within 2 years he would be the first Governor-General of South Africa. The words read ironically, for the reign of Sir Bartle Frere, 1877 to 1880, coincided through no fault of his own with the darkest period in South African history. End of section 47. Section 48 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 24. Afghanistan and South Africa, 1878 to 1880, Part 2. Less than a month after Sir Bartle Frere reached Cape Town, March 31st, 1877, another agent of Lord Carnarvon's took a step which opened a new chapter in British policy in South Africa. Sir Theophilus Shepstone was Secretary for Native Affairs in Natal, and no man had more intimate knowledge of the native problem. In October 1876 he was sent out by Lord Carnarvon as Special Commissioner to inquire respecting certain disturbances which had taken place in territories adjoining the colony of Natal. And he was authorized at his discretion, and provided it were desired by the inhabitants, to annex to the British Dominion all or part of the territories which formed the scene of his inquiry. The scene was the Transvaal Republic. At this moment the Boers of the Transvaal were in serious danger of annihilation at the hands of their native neighbours. More than this, the condition and policy of the Republic constituted a serious menace to the reputation and even the existence of the whole white population of South Africa. The Boers had incurred the bitter enmity of Cetshwayo, king of the powerful tribe of the Zulus, as well as the Ndebele chief Lobengula. With another chief, Sekukun, they were in 1876 actually at war. Morally and materially the Boers were bankrupt, and their native enemies were only awaiting the opportunity to eat them up. That process might begin with the Boers, it was not likely to end with them. Under these circumstances, Shepstone, after 3 months of careful inquiry, decided that annexation was the only remedy for the disease, and on April 12, 1877, he took over the administration of the Transvaal in the Queen's name, promising to the Boers complete self-government under the British Crown. The President, Mr. Burgers, after a formal protest, retired to Cape Town on a pension. His rival, the Vice President, Mr. Kruger, proceeded to London and tried to persuade Lord Carnarvon to reverse the policy of his agent. This the Colonial Secretary declined to do. That the annexation saved the Boers of the Transvaal from destruction is hardly open to question, but it left the British government face to face in a more acute form than ever before with the native problem. A series of disputes with the Zulus led in January 1879 to the outbreak of war. The history of that war may be thus briefly summarized: one grievous disaster, several deeds of heightened heroism, one great and final victory. At Isandlwana, January 22nd, a British force of 800 whites and 500 natives was literally cut to pieces. This was the disaster more than half redeemed by the heroic defense of Rorke's Drift. For 11.5 hours, less than 100 men of the 24th, under 2 subalterns, Bromhead and Chard, held the drift against 4,000 Zulus. The defense of this post on the Buffalo Road saved Natal. The final victory was won by Lord Chelmsford at Ulundi in the Zulu territory on July 4th. Cetshwayo was afterwards captured and sent as a prisoner to Cape Town, and the power of his people was finally broken. In the course of a war brief but full of incident, the exiled Prince Imperial of France, the heir of Napoleon III, who had volunteered to serve with the British force, was unfortunately killed in a reconnaissance June 1st, owing to the carelessness of the officer who had been entrusted with the operation. Before the year 1879 closed, a British force destroyed the power of Sekukun, and this inveterate enemy of the Boers joined Cetshwayo in captivity. The Boers could now breathe freely. The English had destroyed their enemies. The Dutch leaders had never ceased to protest against annexation, and their visits to London led them to hope much for the rapid vicissitudes of party government. Their hopes were not destined to disappointment. In the Transvaal, Frere found in 1879 that the Boers, despite official assertions in London, were confident that their country would be given back. The history of the retrocession of the Orange Free State had taught them a lesson. Most unfortunately, there had been grave procrastination in regard to the fulfilment of Shepstone's promise of self-government. In June 1879, Sir Garnet Wolseley was sent out to take over as High Commissioner, Supreme Civil and Military Command. Shortly after his arrival, a Crown Colony Constitution was conferred upon the Transvaal, but this was far short of the legitimate expectations of the Boers, and their disappointment was great. The new High Commissioner declared in the Queen's name that it was the will and determination of Her Majesty's Government that the Transvaal should remain forever an integral portion of Her Majesty's dominions in South Africa. Her Majesty's Government was about to change hands. In the autumn of 1879, Mr. Gladstone insisted in his Midlothian speeches on the insanity of the free subjects of a monarch going to coerce the free subjects of a republic. On coming into power in 1880, his government declared that under no circumstances can the Queen's authority in the Transvaal be relinquished. Bitter was the disappointment of the Boers, and on December 16, 1880, Messrs. Kruger, Pretorius, and Joubert issued a proclamation declaring the independence of the Transvaal Republic. The moment was well chosen. The Basuto rebellion was in full progress, the Transvaal was almost denuded of British troops, and on December 10th some companies of the 94th were surprised and cut to pieces at Bronkhorstspruit, a place about 40 miles from Pretoria. Sir George Colley had succeeded Wolseley in July, and with a small force he hurried up to Newcastle in January 1881. Checked with heavy loss at Laing's Nek, January 28th, and again at Ingogo, February 7th, he met his death in the disastrous defeat at Majuba Hill, February 26th. Ireland combined with South Africa to compel an early meeting of Parliament, January 6th, 1881, and the Queen's speech emphasized the duty of taking military measures with a view to the prompt vindication of my authority. Sir Frederick Roberts was sent out in command of a considerable force, but he arrived in South Africa only to find that Sir Evelyn Wood, who succeeded Colley, had signed an agreement with the Boers acknowledging their right to complete self-government under the suzerainty of the Queen, March 23rd. The Pretoria Convention, in which these terms were embodied, was amended 3 years later by the Convention of London, February 27th, 1884. The latter treaty acknowledged the South African Republic, and while retaining the control of external relations, deleted all reference to the suzerainty of the Queen. The whole policy of retrocession was violently assailed by the Conservative opposition in England, and it signally failed to achieve a final settlement in South Africa. Between 1881 and the close of the century, a series of profound changes passed over South Africa. British sovereignty was extended over Bechuanaland, 1885, over Zululand, 1886, and in 1889 the British South Africa Company was incorporated by royal charter and accepted the administration of Mashonaland. In 1894 the company broke the power of the Ndebele's and annexed their territory. The conclusion of a convention with Germany in 1890 and with Portugal in 1891 reminded us and others that we had European neighbours in South Africa. Meanwhile, in the Transvaal itself, an event of first-rate importance had taken place. Gold in great profusion was discovered in 1886 on the Witwatersrand, and the discovery attracted a crowd of adventurers who introduced into the social and economic life of the South African Republic an entirely new strain. The slow-moving, intensely conservative farmers deeply resented this intrusion. Oil would not mix with water. The newcomers demanded political rights commensurate with their contribution to the wealth of the community. The Boer government refused to grant them. At the close of the year 1895, the Uitlanders attempted to take by force what was denied to argument. Dr. Jameson, the administrator of the British South Africa Company, raided with an armed force the Transvaal territory. His force was crushed, his confederates in Johannesburg were imprisoned, Jameson himself and his comrades were handed over to the British government. The fiasco of the raid served only to increase the tension between the Boer oligarchy and the Uitlanders in the Transvaal, and at the same time rendered it more difficult for the paramount power to interfere. In 1897, Sir Alfred, now Viscount Milner, was appointed to succeed Sir Hercules Robinson as High Commissioner. In April 1899 he forwarded to the Queen a petition signed by 21,000 British subjects resident in the Transvaal, praying that the Queen would make inquiry into their grievances and secure for them an adequate and permanent remedy. In May 1899 the High Commissioner met President Kruger in conference at Bloemfontein. The conference proved abortive, and on October 10th the two Boer republics declared war. The war opened disastrously for Great Britain, but the resistance of the Boers was gradually worn down, and in May 1902 peace was concluded at Vereeniging on the Vaal. The long contest for supremacy in South Africa was at last ended, and ended in the only possible way. The two burgher states were annexed to the British Crown. Peace was no sooner signed than matters began to settle down with remarkable rapidity. So rapidly that it was found possible to confer self-government upon the Transvaal in 1906 and upon the Orange River Colony in 1907. But as in the case of Canada and Australia, the attainment of responsibility was but the prelude to a further development. The Union Act of 1909 brought the four self-governing colonies into a political union. Thus was the dream of Sir George Grey and Lord Carnarvon more than fulfilled. They had dreamt of confederation, but while the constitutions of Canada and Australia were genuinely federal, that of South Africa is unitary. The four colonies merged their identity in that of United South Africa, and accept henceforward the status of provinces. With the Union Act, the final stage in the constitutional evolution of South Africa has, we may presume, been reached. Spasmodic violence, alternating with impatient dropping of the reins, first severity and then indulgence and then severity again, with no persisting in any one system, a process which drives nations mad as it drives children. Such was Froude's summary of England's dealing with South Africa in the 19th century. The 20th opens with a happier prospect. We must now return, after a prolonged parenthesis, to the closing days of the Beaconsfield administration. The threatenings of war in Eastern Europe, a forward policy eventuating in war both in Afghanistan and South Africa, such were the questions which, to the casual observer, seemed to dominate the political situation. Not so did the Prime Minister read the signs of the times. On the eve of the election of 1880, Lord Beaconsfield indited to the Duke of Marlborough, then Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a letter which was in effect a political manifesto. It sought to concentrate the attention of the electorate upon a single topic. Ireland was distracted by a danger in its ultimate results scarcely less disastrous than pestilence and famine, by an attempt to sever the constitutional tie which unites it to Great Britain in that bond which has formed the power and prosperity of both. Throughout the first years of Lord Beaconsfield's administration, Ireland had enjoyed a spell of unusual prosperity and tranquillity. That spell was broken by agricultural depression in 1878. But the cardinal feature of the Irish question during the Conservative regime was not economic but political. The years between 1874 and 1880 witnessed the growth of a new Irish party, both in Ireland itself and at Westminster. Mr. Gladstone complacently believed that he had discharged in full the debt of England to Ireland. The majority of the Irish electors did not share his optimism, and it is a grim commentary upon this view that the first general election after the passing of the Acts of 1869 and 1870 should have resulted in the return for the first time of a majority of Irish members pledged to the repeal of the Union. But although the Home Rulers numbered close on 60 in the Parliament of 1874, Mr. Butts's annual motion was treated with contemptuous indifference. Legislation for Ireland did not occupy much of the time of this Parliament. The Peace Preservation Act was renewed in 1875, though with considerable modification, for a further period of 5 years. The Westmeath Act was renewed until 1877, but the most important legislation of this Parliament had reference to education. $1 million of money from the Irish Church surplus was appropriated in 1878 to the encouragement of intermediate education, and in 1879 a further $1.25 million was taken from the same source to provide pensions for elementary teachers. The same year witnessed successful legislation on the question which had brought disaster upon Mr. Gladstone. If the scope of Lord Beaconsfield's Irish University Act has been as a rule misunderstood, if the criticism of it is generally distorted, the fault lies partly with its author. Under a most unpretentious aspect, the Act contained the germ of a great concession. The Queen's University was abolished, and in its place the Royal University of Ireland was set up. The new university was to be primarily an examining body, but the point which has escaped attention is that it was supplied with the means of rewarding merit by fellowships, scholarships, and prizes. Of this indirect endowment the Roman Catholics have freely availed themselves. Thus the difficulty as to the state endowment of a sectarian institution was surmounted, or rather circumvented, with singular adroitness. "This is done," said Lord Beaconsfield in private conversation, "in such a way that it will not be understood, and when in due time the people of Great Britain find that they are accepting the principle of an endowment which is quite inadequate, their sense of justice will cause them to admit that the Irish Roman Catholics are entitled to a properly endowed university college. In fact, what we are doing is to place the ball at the feet of the Roman Catholics, and if they do not kick it, the fault will be theirs and not ours." The conversation is well vouched for and is eminently characteristic. Disraeli was never happier than when educating his party and his countrymen. The morality of his methods might be questioned, but their ingenuity was undeniable. During the period that followed, the Irish Roman Catholics kicked the ball to some purpose, but it is questionable whether the people of Great Britain ever realized that it had been placed surreptitiously at their feet. By this time, however, a new force had made itself manifest in Irish politics, and a new movement had been inaugurated. Isaac Butt passed away, a weary and disappointed man, in 1879. His nominal successor in the leadership of the Home Rule party was Mr. Shaw, but some time before Butt's death a new leader had leapt to the front in the person of Charles Stewart Parnell. Mr. Parnell was an Irish landowner of gentle birth, on his father's side an Anglo-Celt, on his mother's side an American. He had none of the gifts of the demagogue, least of all the Irish demagogue. No natural gift of speech, no passion, no presence. On the other hand, he was a born leader of men, and he acquired in high degree the art of parliamentary tactics. Watchful, acute, restrained, he rarely made a blunder in the House of Commons, and never missed an opportunity. For English politicians and English people he had a genuine contempt, mingled with a hatred which was as near passionate as any feeling he could entertain. To his Irish confederates his attitude was one of consistent hauteur and aloofness. Inscrutable as Disraeli, he was as absolute in authority as Gladstone. He was only just of age when his sympathies were excited by the execution of the Fenian prisoners in Manchester. A visit to America, 1871, confirmed both his sympathy for Fenianism and his hatred of England. He entered Parliament in 1875, took the measure of that assembly in a moment, and within 2 years was one of the most powerful forces in the House. He decided from the first that Home Rule must be achieved by tactics at Westminster and by agitation in Ireland and America. For English opinion he cared nothing, and he set himself deliberately to defy and to degrade the House of Commons by a policy of obstruction. In 1878 he cemented an alliance with the Clan na Gael or New Fenians by a second visit to America, and convinced the Irish Americans for the first time of the efficacy of parliamentary action. In the same year he found a valuable, though not entirely congenial ally, in an ex-convict, Michael Davitt, recently released on ticket of leave from Dartmoor, where he had been serving a term of imprisonment for being concerned with the secret importation of firearms into the kingdom. Davitt was not only a separatist but a socialist, a disciple of Henry George, and convinced that the sovereign remedy for the economic and social disease of Ireland was the nationalization of the land. With this particular prescription Parnell had no sympathy, but Davitt made a useful ally, and in 1879 the Land League was founded, with Parnell as its first president. The avowed objects of the League were to reduce rack rents and to facilitate the purchase of farms by the cultivators. The real object was the complete destruction of Irish landlordism, because landlordism was a British garrison which barred the way to national independence. Circumstances were favourable to this new agrarian campaign. The harvest of 1879 was the worst since the famine, and the distress in Ireland was so great that the Duchess of Marlborough opened a special relief fund, and the government advanced funds from the church surplus to be supplied through the landlords to reproductive works. Lord Beaconsfield, therefore, was not merely attempting to divert attention from his own misdeeds when, in his historic letter to the Duke of Marlborough, he directed the interest of his countrymen to the condition of Ireland, but a voice much more powerful at the moment than Lord Beaconsfield was exposing from the housetops the dead fruits of imperialism. The outstanding feature of the general election of 1880 was beyond all question the Midlothian campaign waged in the district round Edinburgh by Mr. Gladstone with a vigour and resourcefulness wonderful for any man, miraculous in a man of over 70. The results were not incommensurate with the effort. The campaign gave the Liberals a majority of nearly 120 over the Conservatives, of 50 over Conservatives and Home Rulers combined. But the campaign did more than give the Liberals a large majority. It put Mr. Gladstone in power. Since his definite retirement in 1875, the party in the House of Commons had been led with excellent temper and dignity, though not quite effectively, by Lord Hartington. But it was Lord Granville whom Mr. Gladstone invariably regarded as the leader of the party and his destined successor in the premiership. Lord Beaconsfield accepted his unexpected defeat with unruffled equanimity, and following the precedent he had himself set in 1868, he resigned before the meeting of Parliament, April 21st. The Queen immediately sent for Lord Hartington. Lord Hartington had accepted the leadership with reluctance and had been deeply embarrassed by the role which, after his retirement, Mr. Gladstone felt it his duty to play. Against his will, he retained the leadership, but having done so, he looked forward to the fitting reward on the victory of his party at the polls. His advice to the Queen, however, was to send for Mr. Gladstone. Her Majesty demurred, and only consented when it was made clear to her by Lord Hartington and Lord Granville conjointly that Mr. Gladstone would accept no place but the first, and that they could not form a government without him. The Queen acquiesced, and on April 23rd Mr. Gladstone kissed hands as First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Lord Granville took the Foreign Office, Lord Hartington the India Office, Lord Selborne again became Lord Chancellor, Lord Kimberley, Colonial Secretary, Forster, Chief Secretary for Ireland. Lord Northbrook took the Admiralty and Childers the War Office. 2 recruits were brought into the Cabinet, Sir William Harcourt as Home Secretary and Mr. Joseph Chamberlain as President of the Board of Trade. Mr. Henry Fawcett, though not in the Cabinet, made noteworthy his tenure of the Post Office, and Sir Charles Dilke represented with uncommon ability the Foreign Office in the House of Commons. Before we turn to the history of the Gladstone Ministry, a word may be said as to the causes of the Conservative debacle. The first may be found in the law of anticlimax. Had Lord Beaconsfield yielded to the temptation of dissolving in 1878, he would probably, though not certainly, have secured a new term of office for his party. Down to that time their record, both administrative and legislative, was a good one. Mr. Cross had made a notable success at the Home Office. Their finance was respectable and their general administration was sound. After 1878, everything went wrong. Trade and agriculture became increasingly depressed. The impudent tactics of Parnell in the House of Commons impaired the reputation of its leader. The defeat at Isandlwana was followed by the tragedy at Kabul. But while these things may account for the defeat of the Conservatives, the victory of the Liberals was due to another cause. It was the moral fervour of Mr. Gladstone, which recaptured the straying allegiance of the Nonconformists, and his resort to new political methods, which for the first time aroused the enthusiasm of the newly enfranchised masses. It is easy to condemn those methods as demagogic, to lament the degradation of British politics, to sigh for the days of greater dignity, repose, and restraint. But the Midlothian campaign was more than the triumph of oratory, more even than the victory of personality. It was the recognition of a stupendous change coming over the face of the political waters, the shifting of the centre of political gravity from Parliament to the platform, from the House of Commons to the constituencies, from the classes to the masses. That change was first registered by the plebiscite which in 1880 placed Mr. Gladstone in power. End of section 48. Section 49 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 25. The Gladstone Administration, Ireland and Egypt, 1880 to 1885, Part 1. The general election of 1880 turned largely upon questions of foreign policy. Mr. Gladstone himself framed a wholesale indictment against what he described as the Beaconsfieldian system. The verdict of the country was in his favour, and it was inevitable that effect should be given to that verdict. It has been already shown how that was done in Afghanistan and South Africa. Lord Beaconsfield did not long survive his defeat. Amid the ruin and reversal of his policy, he passed away on April 19, 1881. His death, under circumstances almost tragic, aroused a wave of deep feeling in the country. The Queen felt it as a personal bereavement and paid unique honour to his memory. With her own hands she placed a wreath upon his coffin and erected in Hughenden Church a tablet bearing an inscription from her own pen. Footnote: to the dear and honoured memory of Benjamin, Earl of Beaconsfield, this memorial is placed by his grateful sovereign and friend, Victoria Regina Imperatrix. Kings love him that speaketh right. End footnote. There was no shrewder judge of character than Queen Victoria, and that she trusted Lord Beaconsfield is a high testimonial to his integrity and patriotism. But to the majority of his countrymen he remains, what throughout a long career he always was, an enigma. His enemies describe him as un-English. His patriotism, they declared, was pinchbeck, and his sense of honour distorted. In home politics they believed him to be merely opportunist, self-seeking, and unprincipled. Much of the adverse criticism was due to early prejudice which he never quite lived down. He was not born to the purple, and for the greater part of his life he had to fight, and fight hard, for his own hand. Nevertheless, inscrutable as he was, some things are clear. He was a man of unyielding courage, of wonderful temper, of intense concentration of purpose. A bitter antagonist, he had real magnanimity and never bore a grudge. He was a skilful tactician, conciliatory as a colleague, and considerate as a chief. Can he be described as a patriot? Patriotism is difficult of definition, but this at least may be said, that no man since Chatham had a higher sense of the honor and greatness of England, as he understood those attributes, than Benjamin Disraeli, Earl of Beaconsfield. Apart from foreign policy, the new government was soon launched upon a sea of troubles. Of the most turbulent, Ireland, something will be said later, but not even Ireland perhaps caused the Cabinet and its chief more worry than what was known as the Bradlaugh case. Charles Bradlaugh, a notorious and outspoken atheist, was returned for Northampton at the general election. The parliamentary oath ran, "I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Queen Victoria, her heirs and successors, according to law, so help me God." Bradlaugh claimed, instead of taking this oath, to be allowed under the Parliamentary Oaths Act of 1866 to make an affirmation. A select committee decided that he was not entitled to do so. He then offered to take the oath with its meaningless addendum, in the usual form. A second select committee decided that he could not do so. The House then refused to allow him to affirm, but under a new standing order he was subsequently allowed to affirm, subject to statute, July 1st. The case was now transferred to the courts, who decided against Bradlaugh's right to affirm, and vacated his seat. Promptly re-elected by Northampton, April 1881, he presented himself to take the oath, and the House repeatedly refused him permission to do so. In February 1882 he administered the oath to himself and was expelled from the House. Re-elected by his constituents, he repeated the process. The government proceeded against him for illegally taking the oath, and the courts decided against Bradlaugh. He then applied for the Chiltern Hundreds, stood again, and was re-elected, 1884. He was again elected by Northampton at the general election of 1885, and Mr. Speaker Peel then declared that he knew of no right whatever to intervene between him and the form of legal and statutable obligation. Bradlaugh quietly took the oath and remained until his death, 1891, a highly respected member of the House. In 1888 an Affirmation Act was passed, and in 1891 all the resolutions against Bradlaugh were expunged from the Journal. The case is important for several reasons. Like the case of Wilkes, it raised the question as to the relations between the House of Commons and a constituency, and also the relations between the House and the courts of law. In 1884 the court refused to interfere with the privilege of the House of Commons to control its own proceedings and its own members. The matter had a political as well as a constitutional significance. It gave a very bad start to the new Parliament and the new government. It led to the virtual supersession of Sir Stafford Northcote as leader of the opposition. It brought into existence a distinct group of young Conservatists, a fourth party of 4 members, footnote, Churchill, Gorst, Balfour, and Drummond Wolff, end footnote, and into special prominence a new parliamentary personality, Lord Randolph Churchill. With the domestic legislation of this Parliament we must deal summarily. The Burials Act, 1880, removed a grievance of nonconformists by permitting them to bury their dead in parish churchyards with religious forms selected by themselves or without any at all. The Ground Game Act, 1880, popularly known as the Hares and Rabbits Act, allowed tenant farmers to protect their crops from vermin and to share the sport of their landlords. The Agricultural Holdings Act, 1883, strengthened the Act of 1875 by making compensation for improvements compulsory instead of permissive. More important was the Employers' Liability Act of 1880, which gave the workman a legal right to compensation from his employer for injury sustained in the course of his employment through negligent management. The Bankruptcy Act, passed by Mr. Chamberlain in 1883, was a bold assumption of responsibility on the part of a State Department. Its effect was to transfer the control over insolvent estates from the Court of Bankruptcy to the Board of Trade and its official receivers. Less successful was the Electric Lighting Act of 1882, passed by the same energetic administrator. The intention of the Act was to encourage municipal enterprise in the provision of electric light. The result was to place serious obstacles in the path of private enterprise and to keep Great Britain 20 years behind any other civilized country in regard to the commercial development of electricity. So disastrous was the Act that in 1888 Parliament thought it well to amend it and to give rather more encouragement to private enterprise. But a powerful obstructive weapon still remained in the hands of the municipalities. By obtaining a provisional order, they could block private competition and yet do nothing themselves. That gas-owning corporations should have sought to postpone the advent of a powerful competitor was natural. But this episode is an apt illustration of the evil that frequently arises from well-intentioned legislation. A useful act was passed in 1883 to diminish corrupt practices at elections, and in 1884 the government reopened the whole question of parliamentary reform. During the previous decade, repeated attempts had been made, notably by Sir George Trevelyan, to assimilate the county franchise to that established in boroughs by the Act of 1867. From 1872 to 1879, an annual motion was defeated by considerable majorities. But in 1884, the government, of which Trevelyan was now a member, made themselves responsible for the bill. It passed through the House of Commons, but the Lords, on the motion of Lord Cairns, declined to assent to a fundamental change in the electoral body until they had before them the details of the promised scheme for the redistribution of seats. The action of the Lords aroused a violent agitation in the country, and bitter attacks were made upon the Second Chamber. Their action had logic and reason behind it, yet the country resented delay. The case was eminently one for compromise, but an impartial arbitrator was needed to bring the parties together. Rarely in modern politics has the Crown played a more useful part than in making peace between the two parties and the two Houses in the autumn of 1884. The Queen was greatly impressed by the gravity of the situation, and during the recess she laboured assiduously to bring the two sides together, and not in vain. Mr. Gladstone met Lord Salisbury and Sir Stafford Northcote and discussed with them the details of the redistribution scheme. Satisfied on the main points, the Conservative leaders allowed the Franchise Bill to pass, and in 1885 the Redistribution Act also became law. By the former the county was assimilated to the borough franchise, and some 2 million voters were added to the electoral register. The latter went some way toward the principle of equal electoral areas. All boroughs with less than 15,000 inhabitants were disfranchised and merged in the county districts. Boroughs with less than 50,000 inhabitants were to lose one member. For the rest, with the exception of 22 towns which retained 2 members apiece, and certain universities, the whole country, counties and boroughs alike, was divided into single-member constituencies. In order to effect this, 12 additional members were added to the House, bringing up the total number to 670. A profound change was thus accomplished virtually by consent. That consent, however, was obtained by the mediation of the Crown, and Mr. Gladstone had good reason to tender his grateful thanks to the Queen for the wise, gracious, and steady influence on Her Majesty's part which had so powerfully contributed to bring about this accommodation and to avert a serious crisis of affairs. The imminent danger of a collision between the two branches of the legislature was only one of the many anxieties which pressed upon the Prime Minister. Ever since the Liberals had returned to power, they had been harassed by difficulties in Ireland. Lord Beaconsfield had seen the cloud, then no bigger than a man's hand. Nobody at the time believed that his warning was other than an election device. His opponents discovered to their cost how accurate his diagnosis had been. The post of difficulty was assigned to Mr. Forster, with Lord Cooper as his Lord Lieutenant. They began their administration valiantly. They declined to renew the Peace Preservation Act and declared that they would try to govern Ireland under the ordinary law. Within 6 months they discovered its insufficiency, but sought their reluctant colleagues to call Parliament together and obtain for them further powers. In the meantime, the Government had passed an Act for the Relief of Distress, and had attempted to pass a Compensation for Disturbance Bill. More than 1,000 evictions had taken place in the first 6 months of 1880. Lord Hartington himself, the heir to a great Irish property, declared that some landlords were taking advantage of the agricultural distress to clear their estates of poor tenants without expense to themselves. The bill proposed that an evicted tenant should be entitled to compensation for disturbance if he could prove that he was unable to pay his rent owing to the bad harvests of the last 3 years, that he was willing to continue his tenancy on just and reasonable terms, and that these terms had been unreasonably refused by the landlord. The bill was to remain in operation only until the close of the year, but even so it had few friends. In its ultimate form, the Parnellites declined to support it, and though it was carried in the Commons, the Lords rejected it by 282 to 52 votes. Its rejection gave the signal, if not the excuse, for a terrible outbreak of lawlessness in Ireland. Speaking at Ennis in September, Parnell launched the boycotting campaign. The man who took a farm from which the tenant had been evicted was to be put into a moral Coventry, to be isolated from his kind as if he was a leper of old. The tale of agrarian outrages mounted higher and higher. In October, the Government resolved to prosecute Mr. Parnell, Mr. Biggar, Mr. John Dillon, Mr. Sexton, and others for conspiracy to prevent the payment of rent. But the jury, as was foreseen, disagreed. Mr. Forster was convinced that further powers were necessary, but Mr. Gladstone, believing him to be a very impracticable man, was slow to agree. His colleagues, however, were against the Prime Minister, and he submitted. Parliament was summoned in the first week of 1881, and was at once asked to arm the Irish executive with further powers. The Protection of Life and Property Bill gave the Lord Lieutenant power to detain in prison without trial for a period not exceeding beyond September 30th, 1882, any person reasonably suspected of treasonable practices or agrarian offences. The proposal was drastic, but not difficult to justify. In Ireland, said Forster, the Land League law is supreme, and there is a real reign of terror over the whole country. With painful and fatal precision, said Gladstone, the steps of crime dog the steps of the Land League. The leaders of that league in the House of Commons used every art to obstruct the progress of the bill. A sitting of 41 hours was ended by the courageous action of Mr. Speaker Brand, who on his own responsibility stopped the debate and put the question. Thus was the first reading carried. 36 Irish members were suspended, and the powers of the Speaker in regard to the restriction of debate were enlarged. A second bill prohibiting the possession of arms or ammunition in a proclaimed district was also passed before the end of March. In April, Mr. Gladstone himself introduced a bill described by Lord Morley of Blackburn as giving the Irish peasant the charter of his liberation. As a fact, the bill ignored the best Irish opinion of the day and did nothing toward a permanent solution of the agrarian problem. It was based upon the principle of the 3 F's: free sale, fixity of tenure, and fair rent. It gave to sitting tenants increased security of tenure, the right of selling their interest in the holding to the highest bidder, and the privilege of having a fair rent fixed for a period of 15 years by a judicial tribunal. There were also clauses which proved practically inoperative for facilitating land purchase and the multiplication of occupying owners. The bill was based, like the Act of 1870, on the assumption, denied by few genuine Irish landlords, that the Irish tenant possesses an interest in the soil quite unlike anything which could be equitably claimed by an English tenant. But it proceeded to recognize this right in the wrong way. It conferred a vast boon upon the sitting tenant at the expense not only of the landlord but of all future tenants. The consequence has been that the respective interests of landlord and tenant have varied not in concurrent but in inverse ratios. The lower the rent, the higher the value of the tenant right, until the one threatens to absorb the other, and the fee simple is virtually transferred to the sitting tenant. Had Mr. Gladstone condescended to listen to the best Irish opinion, or even to that of his own Irish law officers, the tenant right would have been fixed in the terms of the rent demanded or offered, and the worst results of the bill would have been avoided. It was, in fact, a fair weather act. It encountered storms of exceptional severity, and it foundered. The solution of the problem has been found not in the recognition of dual ownership, but in the creation of cultivating owners by means of state-aided purchase. The bill cost Mr. Gladstone one of his ablest colleagues, the Duke of Argyll, but despite the Duke's vigorous opposition, the House of Lords, with some modifications, accepted the bill, and it passed into law. It did nothing to improve the immediate situation in Ireland. The Parnellites spurned it, outrages multiplied, the jails were filled with suspects. On October 7th, Mr. Gladstone, much irritated by the reception accorded to his remedial legislation, declared that the resources of civilization were not exhausted, and on October 13th, Mr. Parnell was arrested and lodged in Kilmainham jail. On October 18th, the League issued a manifesto commanding that no rent should be paid until the leaders were released, and 2 days later the League itself was proclaimed as an illegal and criminal association. Thus Forster waged his brave fight against the forces of lawlessness in Ireland. "If I am arrested," Parnell had said, "Captain Moonlight will take my place." He did. Forster, though in great personal danger, never faltered. When Parliament met in February, the Queen was able with truth to say that the condition of Ireland showed signs of improvement, and had Forster been loyally supported, he might have won through. But his chief was already off on another tack. With splendid courage, Mr. Forster had personally visited the most disturbed districts in Ireland during the winter, and had escaped unhurt. On April 19th, 1882, he left Dublin to attend the Cabinet which was to decide the future policy of the government. But for the fact that he decided at the last moment to dine at Kingston instead of in Dublin, Forster would that night have been murdered by a band of assassins known as the Invincibles. On April 28th, the announcement of Lord Spencer's appointment as Viceroy in place of Earl Cooper gave substance to rumours of a change in policy. The rumours had some foundation in fact. The Cabinet learnt that if they would release Parnell and other suspects, the conspiracy which has been used to get up boycotting and outrages would now be used to put them down. On May 2nd, the Prime Minister announced the release of all suspects not associated with the commission of crime, and announced also the resignation of the Chief Secretary. The Kilmainham Treaty, so called from the jail in which the Irish leaders were at that time confined, had been signed. The Prime Minister had now flung the Irish agents of the government over and made peace with the invincible agitator. This is the account of Parnell's brilliant biographer, and this his summary of the terms. The government were to introduce a satisfactory arrears bill, and Parnell was to slow down the agitation. To such a treaty a man of Forster's temper could be no party. Mr. Forster's successor was not, as had been anticipated, Mr. Chamberlain, the representative of the extreme left, but Lord Frederick Cavendish, brother of Lord Hartington, the leader of the Whig section of the Cabinet, and himself an intimate friend of the Prime Minister. On May 4th, Forster made a statement explanatory of his resignation. In the middle of a scene already sufficiently dramatic, Parnell entered the House and confronted his old adversary and his new friends. On May 6th, the new Viceroy made his state entry into Dublin. Lord Frederick Cavendish arrived with him. On the same evening, the new Chief Secretary and Mr. Burke, the Under Secretary at the Castle, were stabbed to death by a gang of Invincibles in Phoenix Park. The murder of Lord Frederick was an accident. The intended victim of the assassins was the faithful agent of the Castle, Mr. Burke. Mr. Forster immediately offered to resume his post. The offer was declined. In January 1883 the Invincibles were captured and brought to trial. James Carey, one of the leaders in the plot and a member of the Dublin Town Council, turned Queen's evidence. 5 of his associates were hanged and 3 were sent to penal servitude for life. Carey himself was murdered on shipboard as he was flying to South Africa, and his murderer was hanged. Thus ended this terrible episode in Irish history. Parnell expressed, and probably with sincerity, his detestation of the dastardly deed which had taken place. It is an evidence that he was, perhaps for the only time in his life, completely unnerved. In Ireland there was genuine lamentation over the fate of the innocent stranger, Lord Frederick Cavendish, profound sympathy for his courageous widow, but little to spare for the devoted public servant who perished with him. On the refusal of Sir Charles Dilke to take the chief secretaryship without a seat in the cabinet, it was accepted by Mr. George Trevelyan, who with Lord Spencer braced himself bravely for one of the most difficult tasks that ever confronted English statesmen. A Crimes Act passed in 1882 gave the executive power in serious cases to substitute a commission of 3 judges for trial by jury, to prohibit meetings and suppress newspapers, to deport aliens, to levy compensation on the districts for murders and maiming, and to search for the apparatus of crime by night or day. It also enlarged the summary jurisdiction of magistrates and in other ways increased the efficiency of the law. But with coercion, conciliation was to go hand in hand, and the Crimes Act was accompanied by an Arrears Act, which, partly at the expense of the state and partly of the landlords, relieved the tenants from a burden of debt and enabled them to go into the land courts to get a fair rent fixed under the Act of 1881. Thanks to the increased powers given to the executive by the Crimes Act, the murderers of Lord Frederick Cavendish and Burke were brought to justice, and the more serious kinds of agrarian crime were virtually stamped out. The calm, courageous, and impartial administration of Lord Spencer and Mr. Trevelyan gradually wore down their lawless opponents. At Westminster, the obstructive tactics of the Parnellites compelled the House of Commons to spend an autumn session, 1882, in revising its rules of procedure. The most important of these gave authority to the Speaker to close your debate. In Ireland, Mr. Parnell launched a new association to take the place of the suppressed Land League, to which he gave the name of the National League, October 17, 1882. The avowed object of the new league was to secure Home Rule for Ireland. Its methods were boycotting and intimidation, but guided with superb skill by Parnell, it generally contrived to keep on the right side of the law. Its power was much increased by the inclusion of Ireland in the Franchise Act of 1884. Household suffrage gave Parnell 85 followers in the Parliament elected in 1885. But we anticipate events. Apart from Ireland and the other topics already touched, public attention during the Gladstone government was mainly concentrated upon Egypt. The course of this narrative has already disclosed the consistent reluctance of English statesmen to recognize the importance of Egypt in the general scheme of English policy. Twice Russia had offered it to England, and at Berlin Bismarck, not perhaps without sinister design, pressed it upon Lord Beaconsfield. To Beaconsfield the offer must have been tempting, for he was the first of English statesmen to perceive its significance, but it was declined. From his purchase of the canal shares, a new era in our relations with Egypt dates. The sale of the shares was due to the increasing financial embarrassments of the Khedive Ismail. The debt, which at his accession, 1863, stood at £3,293,000, had increased by 1876 to £94 million. To this carnival of extravagance and oppression we may trace the European intervention in the affairs of Egypt, and thus the whole of the latest phase in its long history. In 1876, Mr. Stephen Cave, who had been sent out to make a report upon Egyptian finance, described the country as suffering from the ignorance, dishonesty, waste, and extravagance of the East, and at the same time from the vast expense caused by hasty and inconsiderate endeavors to adopt the civilization of the West. No description could have been more apt. The English and French creditors of the Khedive, naturally alarmed as to the security of their loans, sent out Mr. Goschen and Mr. Joubert to look after their interests. The immediate result was the establishment of the Caisse de la Dette, May 2nd, 1876. This international commission was originally empowered only to receive the revenue set apart for the service of the debt, and to sanction or veto fresh loans, but its functions were rapidly enlarged to embrace the whole financial administration of the country. Lord Derby refused to nominate an English commissioner, but Mr. Goschen, devoid of Lord Derby's official responsibility, suggested at the Khedive's request the name of Captain Evelyn Baring, a member of the famous financial house and until recently private secretary to Lord Northbrook in India. In this characteristic fashion there was introduced into Egypt the man destined to be the regenerator of the country, the great Pharaoh of modern Egypt. In 1879 Ismail's tyranny and extravagance had become insupportable, and on June 26th his suzerain, the Sultan, was induced by the Powers to procure his abdication. His abdication, writes Lord Cromer, sounded the death knell of arbitrary personal rule in Egypt. But his son and successor Tewfik, though honest and well-meaning, was not the man to cope with the situation by which he was confronted. The country, and most particularly the army, was seething with discontent. Of this discontent an obscure colonel named Arabi Bey became the mouthpiece and representative. It is not even now easy to determine the precise character and significance of the movement which Arabi led. Primarily a military revolt, it was directed partly against Turkish suzerainty, partly against Occidental intervention. Egypt for the Egyptians was the battle cry of the rebels, but how far either Egypt or the Egyptians would have been profited by their success it is difficult to say. On September 9th, 1881, the Khedive found his palace surrounded by a large force under the command of Arabi, and was compelled to assent to their demands. He promised to dismiss 2 of his leading ministers, to accept a responsible ministry, to convoke an assembly of notables before the end of the year, and to limit the functions of the Caisse to the service of the debt. Doctrinaire liberals, particularly in England, hailed with enthusiasm Arabi's success as portending an era of constitutional government for Egypt. Most of those who had knowledge of the facts regarded it differently. The democratic catchwords adopted by Arabi and his faction were in reality a thin veneer, calculated to cover a movement of the regular Oriental type. Europe became more and more uneasy. Order must be restored in Egypt, but how? By Turkey? By the European concert? By France and England conjointly? Or by either of these alone? To any of these alternatives there was objection from one quarter or another. In January 1882, England and France in a joint note assured Tewfik of their support, and in May the combined fleet anchored in the roads of Alexandria. France then expressed a preference for a European conference. The conference met in Constantinople at the end of June and proved entirely abortive. Meanwhile, an émeute at Alexandria precipitated the crisis. On June 11th, the Arabs attacked the European population and slaughtered 50 or more of them, mostly Greeks, in cold blood. Manifestly, says Lord Cromer, something had to be done, for the whole framework of society in Egypt was on the point of collapsing. By June 17th, 14,000 Christians had left the country. Tewfik was powerless to restrain the fanaticism aroused by Arabi, now one of his responsible ministers. The concert of Europe was equally impotent. Great Britain decided to act, if necessary, alone. Sir Bishop Seymour, commanding the British fleet off Alexandria, was instructed to demand that the construction of fortifications should cease. End of Section 49. Section 50 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 25. The Gladstone Administration, Ireland and Egypt, 1880 to 1885, Part 2. The demand being ignored, the Admiral proceeded, July 11th, to bombard and demolish the forts. Arabi let loose the convicts, and then with his troops abandoned the town, which for 2 whole days was delivered up to fire, pillage, and massacre. At length the British Admiral landed a body of bluejackets and marines, and order was tardily restored in the ruined city. From the moment it became clear that decisive action was necessary, France refused to cooperate, and her fleet left Alexandria for Port Said. England had therefore to go through with the task alone. The government moved, July 24th, for a vote of credit for £2,300,000. The first army reserves were called out on the 25th, and the first instalment of troops left Portsmouth on the 27th. Almost simultaneously troops were dispatched from India, and among these the government, following the precedent of Lord Beaconsfield, decided to include a native contingent. The command was entrusted to Sir Garnet Wolseley, who fulfilled his commission with extraordinary promptitude and skill. Debouching not from Alexandria but from Port Said, he landed in Egypt on August 19th, and marching on Cairo across the desert, he inflicted a crushing defeat on Arabi, storming the formidable lines of Tel el-Kebir on September 13th. So masterly were his strategy and tactics that the total British loss in killed was only 54, and in wounded only 342. On September 14th, Cairo surrendered to a couple of squadrons of British cavalry. The series of military operations, to adopt Mr. Gladstone's periphrasis, was now complete. Arabi was captured, brought to trial, sentenced to death, and finally deported to Ceylon. A British army was left in occupation of Egypt in order to complete the restoration of order, or in official phrase, the authority of the Khedive. When that task had been accomplished, the occupation would cease. That such was the genuine desire and intention of the government, there is no shadow of doubt. We shall not keep our troops in Egypt any longer than is necessary, but it would be an act of treachery to ourselves, to Egypt, and to Europe, if we withdrew them without having a certainty, or until there is reasonable expectation, of a stable, a permanent, and a beneficial government being established in Egypt. Thus spoke Lord Granville in the House of Lords, and his famous dispatch on January 3rd, 1883, announced that policy to the great powers. That dispatch further intimated that the position in which Her Majesty's government is placed towards His Highness the Khedive imposes upon them the duty of giving advice, with the object of securing that the order of things to be established shall be of a satisfactory character and possess the elements of stability and progress. Giving advice is, as Lord Milner observes, a charming euphemism of the best Granvillian brand. But Lord Granville was at one with his colleagues in his anxiety that the function should be temporary. The anomaly of the whole position was strikingly illustrated by the events which shortly followed in the Egyptian Soudan. The Arabs of the south, as of the north, had long groaned beneath the burdens imposed upon them by their Egyptian taskmasters. Colonel Charles Gordon, who had acted as governor of the Soudan under Ismail, retired in 1879, and from that moment the condition of its inhabitants was pitiful. Consequently, when Mohammed Ahmed announced himself as the Mahdi, or promised Messiah, the Sudanese rallied to his standard and drove the Egyptian troops into the fortresses. In September 1883, General Hicks was dispatched by the Khedive in command of a wholly inadequate Egyptian force to reconquer the Soudan. In November, Hicks Pasha, his European staff, and his Egyptian soldiers were cut to pieces by the Mahdi near Shekan. Sir Evelyn Baring, who in September 1883 had returned to Egypt as Consul General, advised the abandonment of the Soudan. Lord Dufferin, in his report of 1883, had advised that the Western Soudan should be abandoned, and that Egypt should be content to hold Khartoum and Sennar. Lord Wolseley concurred in this opinion. After the Hicks disaster, however, Lord Wolseley urged upon Lord Hartington that a strong garrison should be established at Aswan, and that reinforcements should be sent to Suakin, Berber, and Khartoum. Lord Hartington agreed with him, and had their advice been accepted, one of the most disastrous episodes in English history might have been avoided. Sir Evelyn Baring and the British soldiers in Cairo were convinced, however, that Egypt could not, without assistance, hold Khartoum. The British cabinet were now face to face with a serious difficulty. The Soudan was no business of ours. Technically it was not, but British officers had been killed there, Egyptian soldiers were still blockaded there, and the Khedive, if he accepted our advice to evacuate, could not calmly leave them there to perish. At this critical moment, General Gordon was on the point of undertaking a mission for the King of the Belgians in the Congo. Asked what he would do in regard to the Soudan, he replied, "I should send out myself." The distracted cabinet caught at the idea, and on January 18, 1884, General Gordon was sent out to Khartoum to report on the situation with a view to immediate evacuation. The Khedive appointed him Governor-General of the Soudan. The Home Government acquiesced in the appointment, and in that capacity he started for Khartoum. Baring disapproved of the mission and still regrets it, but he agreed that if Gordon went out at all, it had better be as Governor-General. That this appointment altered the character of the mission cannot be denied. Still less can it be denied that the Imperial Government approved the alteration. But ministers, especially Mr. Gladstone and Lord Granville, were already uneasy about it. Words, parliamentary words in particular, they could understand. Of decisive action they were afraid. Their hope now was that Gordon would himself decide upon the evacuation of Khartoum without explicit orders to that effect. Meanwhile, the facts of the situation were hardening. Gordon had hardly left Cairo for Khartoum when Colonel Valentine Baker, the head of the Egyptian gendarmerie, was badly defeated in an attempt to relieve Tokar near the Red Sea coast, February 4th. Gordon now found himself besieged by the Mahdists in Khartoum. Lord Wolseley was quick to perceive the danger of the situation, and urged upon the ministers the immediate dispatch of reinforcements to Suakin and the advance of an English brigade to Wadi Halfa. Failure to take prompt action at once might force us into a big war before many months elapsed. Sir Gerald Graham, dispatched to Suakin, inflicted some losses upon the Arabs and held that place securely, but nothing further was done. Baring became insistent that relief should be sent to Khartoum, and in England there was one person in high place whose clear brain penetrated through all the sophistries and ambiguities in which ministers, and especially their chief, delighted to involve themselves. On March 25, 1884, the Queen telegraphed to Lord Hartington, "It is alarming. General Gordon is in danger. You are bound to try and save him. Surely Indian troops might go from Aden, and could bear climate, though British cannot. You have incurred fearful responsibility." What the Queen said, the country thought. Lord Hartington was obviously uneasy, but Mr. Gladstone's mind was intent upon domestic affairs and parliamentary tactics, and precious weeks and even months were allowed to pass before any decision was arrived at. The miserable troops on whom alone Gordon could rely were defeated outside Khartoum on March 16th, and it became clear that if ever Gordon was to leave Khartoum alive, he would have to be succoured by his own countrymen. He himself had begun to realize that he was likely to be deserted. On April 7th he telegraphed, "You state your intention of not sending any relief up here or to Berber, and you refuse me Zobair." He had begged the government to appoint Zobair Pasha, Governor-General of the Soudan, but they demurred to the appointment of a slave dealer. I shall hold out here as long as I can, and if I can suppress the rebellion I shall do so. If I cannot, I shall retire to the equator and leave you the indelible disgrace of abandoning the garrisons of Sennar, Kassala, Berber, and Dongola, with the certainty that you will ultimately be forced to smash up the Mahdi under great difficulties if you would retain peace in Egypt. This telegram merely aroused Mr. Gladstone to the advisability of sending a set of carefully prepared questions to Gordon about his future conditions and plans. April 13th. Baring warned the government that they ought to begin immediate preparations for a relieving expedition in the autumn. April 14th. Lord Hartington confesses 2 days later that he had not the slightest idea what the government proposes to do. His ignorance was shared by all his colleagues, and the way was not made clearer by Gladstone's declaration, May 12th, that the reconquest of the Soudan would be a war of conquest against a people rightly struggling to be free. Berber, the halfway house between Suakin and Khartoum, was captured by the Mahdi, May 26th, an event which still further jeopardized Gordon's position in Khartoum. Nevertheless, Lord Hartington still failed to bring the Cabinet to a decision. Their procrastination was due to no lack of pressure from the ablest of their military advisers, but despite the insistence of Lord Wolseley, nothing had been decided by the end of July. A threat of resignation from Lord Hartington and the Chancellor, Lord Selborne, at last compelled the Premier to divert his attention from parliamentary tactics, and at the beginning of August Gladstone asked the House of Commons for the miserably inadequate sum of £300,000 to enable the Government to undertake operations for the relief of General Gordon should they become necessary. Lord Wolseley was then appointed to the command of the expedition. He left England at the end of August and started from Cairo to lead an expedition up the Nile at the beginning of October. Gordon, asked by the Government why he did not leave Khartoum, replied, "I stay at Khartoum because the Arabs have shut us up and will not let us out." Lord Wolseley made all the haste possible under circumstances of great difficulty, but the procrastination of the Cabinet had delayed the expedition until it was too late. On reaching Korti, December 29th, Lord Wolseley dispatched Sir Herbert Stewart with a small force by land to avoid the wide bend of the Nile. Stewart, after a hard fight at Abu Klea, January 17th, 1885, forced his way to the Nile, not far below Khartoum, but on January 19th was mortally wounded. The command then devolved on Sir Charles Wilson. Exactly a week later, January 26th, the Mahdi stormed Khartoum and General Gordon was killed. Wilson came in sight of the city 2 days after it had fallen. The news of the tragedy reached London on February 5th, and on receipt of it, the Queen dispatched an angry telegram to Gladstone, declaring that it was too fearful to consider that the fall of Khartoum might have been prevented and many precious lives saved by earlier action. To Miss Gordon she expressed in an autograph letter her grief and sympathy and her sense of the stain left upon England by General Gordon's cruel though heroic fate. The Queen exactly expressed the feelings of her people. The House of Lords censured the Government by 189 to 68, and in the Commons they were saved from similar condemnation only by a majority of 14. Their first resolution was to send out large reinforcements to Lord Wolseley to enable him to smash the Mahdi at Khartoum. Before the middle of April other counsels prevailed. The left wing of the Radical party brought pressure to bear upon the Prime Minister, who was more than ready to be convinced. On April 15th the Government decided to abandon the Soudan south of Wadi Halfa, and though retaining the port of Suakin, to abandon the construction, already commenced, of a railway from Suakin to Berber. This sudden volte-face was due only partly to parliamentary pressure. Serious danger was threatening in another quarter. On March 30th, Russia, quick to take advantage of England's preoccupation, had occupied Penjdeh on the frontier of Afghanistan. The danger in Afghanistan passed, and with its passing there was some disposition to modify the policy of complete evacuation of the Soudan, and to retain the province of Dongola. Baring, Wolseley, and Kitchener were all strongly in favour of its retention, and the Queen pressed it on her ministers, but the will of Mr. Gladstone prevailed. The British force was withdrawn in the summer of 1885, and for another 12 years the Soudan was a prey to anarchy. When the Mahdi was poisoned in 1885, the Khalifa whom he had nominated as his successor continued his tyranny. Meanwhile, thanks to the long and patient labours of General Grenville and General Kitchener, the Egyptian army was completely reorganized, and in 1896 the government of the Khedive determined to attempt the reconquest of the Soudan. This decision coincided with, and may have been precipitated by, the withdrawal of the Italians from Kassala. General Kitchener was appointed to the command of the Nile expedition, and slowly and patiently advanced toward the completion of his great design. Before the end of September 1896, Kitchener was in possession of Dongola, Abu Hamed was taken in August 1897, and at the Atbara the dervishes were scattered April 7, 1898. On September 2nd the power of Mahdiism was finally annihilated by the great victory of Omdurman. 2 days later the British and Egyptian forces were paraded before the ruined palace of Khartoum and the shattered tomb of the Mahdi, and there, on the spot where Gordon had perished, a funeral service was held in solemn memory of the dead hero and saint. The Queen conferred a peerage upon General Kitchener, and from Parliament he received £30,000 and formal thanks for the distinguished skill and ability with which he planned and conducted the campaign on the Nile, 1896 to 1898. Never were honours and thanks better deserved. Hardly, however, had General Kitchener reached Khartoum when the diplomatic sky was suddenly overcast by a threatening cloud. The French government had never forgiven themselves for their withdrawal from Egypt at the critical moment in 1882. For more than a dozen years they had impeded in every way the work of financial and political reconstruction undertaken by Great Britain in Egypt. That task, unwillingly assumed but patiently fulfilled, seemed now to be on the point of final triumph and consummation. At the dramatic moment the French reappeared upon the scene. On July 12, 1898, Major Marchand planted the French flag at Fashoda on the Upper Nile. For 2 years past, in the face of every difficulty, this intrepid soldier had been pushing his way from the French Congo across Central Africa. His arrival at Fashoda was well timed, but General Kitchener, steaming up from Khartoum, denied his right to be there as the political representative of France. The victory of Omdurman was a potent argument, but Marchand refused to yield even to it. The quarrel was then referred to the diplomatists. Lord Salisbury claimed for the Khedive all the lands over which the Khalifa had borne away, and made it clear to the French government that the claim would be asserted by the whole force of Great Britain. In the autumn of 1898 the two nations were on the brink of war. France, however, gave way, recalled Marchand, and in March 1899 concluded with Great Britain a comprehensive agreement in regard to the Soudan. By this treaty the rights of Great Britain over the whole Nile basin, from the source of that river to its mouth, were acknowledged. France was confirmed in possession of a great West African empire, but the whole of the Egyptian Soudan was to be subject to the power which ruled at Cairo. Thus the way to the Cape was still open, unblocked by any other European power. From that moment Anglo-French relations rapidly improved, and in 1904 the diplomacy of the Salisbury-Balfour government was crowned by the conclusion of the Anglo-French agreement, whereby France agreed to give Great Britain for 30 years a free hand in Egypt. Thus closed the chapter which had opened in 1882. British policy in the Sudan in 1885 was, as we have hinted, powerfully affected by the increasing tension of Anglo-Russian relations in Central Asia. In regard to Afghanistan, the Gladstone government had reverted in 1881 to the policy of the buffer state. Given the maintenance of friendly relations with a strong Amir, there was little cause for apprehension in the advance of Russia. In 1884, however, it became doubtful whether the buffer could be kept intact. Early in that year, Russia, conscious of England's preoccupation in the Sudan, occupied Merv and Sarax, and thus came within 200 miles of Herat. Such a step was in direct violation of Gortchakov's assurance given to Lord Granville in 1882 that Merv lay outside the sphere of Russian influence. Nevertheless, Lord Granville assented, somewhat tamely, to the proposal of the Russian government that a joint boundary commission should be appointed for the definitive delimitation of the frontier. Sir Peter Lumsden, the English commissioner, reached the Afghan frontier on November 19th. His Russian colleague, M. Zelenoy, excused himself on the score of illness until February. February came, but no Zelenoy. The affront was unmistakable, and British patience was almost exhausted, the more so as the Russians usefully employed the interval by occupying various eligible points on the frontier. The situation could not endure. On March 6, 1885, the Queen addressed to the Tsar a personal appeal that he would assist her in maintaining the peace, but on the 29th Russians and Afghans came into collision at Penjdeh, and the Russians in consequence occupied the place. The Afghans felt that their protector had deserted them. Fortunately, however, the Amir was at this moment at Rawalpindi, where Lord Dufferin had received him with splendid hospitality, and now smoothed his natural indignation with irresistible adroitness. At home the government acted with unusual decision and promptitude. The reserves had already, March 26th, been called out in England, and the news of the seizure of Penjdeh aroused public excitement to the highest pitch. "We know," said Mr. Gladstone, "that the attack was a Russian attack. We know that the Afghans suffered in life, in spirit, and in repute. We know that a blow was struck at the credit and authority of a sovereign, our protected ally, who had committed no offence. We must do our best to have right done in the matter." This speech, April 27th, was the prelude to a motion for a vote of credit of £11 million, 4,500,000 of which were to be for the Sudan expedition. The vote was agreed to without a dissentient voice, a hint not lost upon Russia, who agreed to submit the questions in dispute to the arbitration of the King of Denmark. In the event, Penjdeh, for which Abdur Rahman cared little, was left in the hands of Russia, but in compensation the Amir secured the exclusive control of the Zulfilar Pass, for which he cared much. There was general satisfaction that peace had been preserved, but there was an uneasy suspicion that it had been purchased at the price of a fresh humiliation for British diplomacy. That this impression contributed to the overthrow of the government is undeniable. All through the session they were hard pressed by their opponents in Parliament, but their ultimate fall was due in even greater degree to their own internal weakness and dissensions. With the greatest difficulty had they kept together through the Sudan crisis in 1884, and between the middle of April and the middle of May 1885, no less than 9 members of the Cabinet intimated, on one point or another, an intention to resign. In the last months of their existence, the main cause of division in the Ministry was not foreign policy but Ireland. The Crimes Act was to expire in August. Was it to be renewed, in whole or in part? The Whigs leaned toward partial renewal. The Radical wing insisted that if any portion of the Act were renewed, it must be accompanied by a reform of local government, and perhaps by the establishment of a central administrative board in Dublin. Mr. Gladstone, whose supreme anxiety was to avert a rupture in the Ministry and the party, was hopeful of an adjustment of differences, but nothing was actually settled, and on June 8th an amendment to the budget, moved by Sir Michael Hicks Beach, was carried against the Government by 264 to 252. It was significant that 39 Home Rulers voted in the majority. Mr. Gladstone tendered his resignation to the Queen on the following day, June 9th. Several of his colleagues, notably Lord Hartington, were glad to be released from a task which had become increasingly distasteful, but the Queen demurred to the necessity of resignation. Lord Salisbury, summoned on the 11th, took the same view and pointed out the peculiarity of the circumstances. 2 million new voters had been enfranchised by the Act of 1884, but the new register was not ready, and an immediate dissolution was therefore out of the question. Consequently, the Conservatives, if they took office, would not command a majority in the House of Commons, nor could they appeal to the country to give them one. If they were to come in, it must be on the understanding that the outgoing Ministry would assist them to obtain the necessary supplies and carry on the routine business of State. Mr. Gladstone would give no pledge, and the situation became tense. The crisis lasted from June 11th to June 23rd, and was terminated only by the good offices of the Queen. No less than 6 times in one day did her private secretary, Sir Henry Ponsonby, interview Mr. Gladstone. At last an understanding was arrived at, and on the strength of it Lord Salisbury took office. The revolt of the younger Tories against the leadership of Sir Stafford Northcote was rewarded by the latter's reluctant removal to the House of Lords, where as Earl of Iddesleigh he served as First Lord of the Treasury. Lord Salisbury himself took the Foreign Office, an admirable arrangement if there had been another Premier. Sir Michael Hicks Beach led the House of Commons as Chancellor of the Exchequer until the leader of the Fourth Party was ready. Lord Randolph Churchill modestly contented himself for the moment with the India Office. Mr. W. H. Smith went to the War Office, Lord George Hamilton to the Admiralty, and Sir Richard Cross returned to the Home Office. Sir Hardinge Giffard became Lord Halsbury and Lord Chancellor. Mr. Gibson, who in late years had done good service to the party on the platform, became Lord Chancellor for Ireland with a peerage, Lord Ashburn, and a seat in the Cabinet. But of all the appointments, perhaps the most significant was that of Lord Carnarvon to be Lord Lieutenant of Ireland with a seat in the Cabinet. Lord Carnarvon, a man of high integrity and great independence, made no secret of his leanings towards some form of extended local government for Ireland, and his appointment went far to secure the Irish vote for his party at the general election. This took place according to arrangement in November. The English boroughs in the main returned Conservatives, but the new electors in the counties proved their gratitude to Mr. Gladstone by giving the Liberal party a majority of 86. This figure exactly equalled the number of Mr. Parnell's followers. The strength of the Home Rule party was the deciding factor in the situation. Before Parliament was opened, the Conservatives shed their Lord Lieutenant, and in the first critical division on the address, January 26, 1886, the Parnellites threw in their lot with the opposition and left the Ministry in a minority of 79. Of the majority, 74 were Parnellites. Lord Salisbury immediately resigned, and Mr. Gladstone was asked to form a government. Lord Hartington declined to serve in it, and his example was followed by many of the most distinguished of his former colleagues. The old Liberal party was rent in twain. A new issue of paramount importance was definitely raised, an issue destined to divide English parties for at least a quarter of a century to come. That issue is not yet decided. The chapter of history opened by Mr. Gladstone in 1886 is not yet concluded. At this point, therefore, it is fitting that this detailed narrative should stop. In more than one sense, the year 1885-1886 marks the parting of the ways. The reform movement, temporarily arrested by the French Revolution, but breaking forth after the Peace of 1815 with irresistible force, had now, for the time being, clearly reached its term. By successive stages, the great mass of the manhood of the nation had been admitted to the responsibilities of citizenship. To the arbitrament of the new democracy a great issue was presented in 1886. They were invited to confer upon Ireland a separate legislature with an executive responsible thereto. The proposal seemed to them to be fraught with danger to the Commonwealth, and they installed, and for 20 years, with one short interval, maintained in power the party which was pledged to preserve the integrity of the United Kingdom. Not, however, until the close of that period, 1905, did the recently enfranchised voters realize the potency of the weapon placed in their hands. By that time, the new ruling class had learned more lessons than were dreamt of in the educational philosophy of Robert Lowe. Before the vast issues, social and economic, which gradually emerged as the century faded, even that of legislative independence for Ireland seemed to pale into insignificance. These problems belong to the future. The historian is concerned with the past. Truthful narration may be required of him, but not speculation. If the dead must bury the dead, the unborn must struggle in the womb of time. End of section 50. Section 51 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 26. Epilogue, 1885 to 1901. Democracy and Empire. Close of the Victorian Era, Part 1. The formal argument of this work reaches its logical conclusion in the Parliamentary Reform Acts of 1884 and 1885. Nevertheless, in order to sketch the progress of events down to the close of the Victorian era, some words may be added by way of epilogue. To a period already regarded as old-fashioned, the usage can hardly be deemed inappropriate. For nearly 10 years, Ireland continued to occupy the first place in political interest. On coming into office in 1885, the Conservatives deliberately declined to renew the expiring Crimes Act. This decision was admittedly a grave one, and it did not stand alone. Combined with a virulent attack by Lord Randolph Churchill upon Lord Spencer's administration, it gave substance to the prevalent rumours that the Tory government meant to come to terms with Parnell. A promised re-inquiry into a notorious murder case, and the passing of an act to facilitate land purchase seemed to afford further confirmation. The Land Act of 1885, popularly known as the Ashbourne Act, was one of the least pretentious, but as far as it went, one of the most effective agrarian measures ever enacted for Ireland. By a simple use of state credit, it made a real beginning with the work of converting tenant cultivators into proprietors of the soil. A tenant desiring to purchase his holding and agreeing with his landlord to do so could borrow from the state the whole sum required at 4%. By this means, not only was his rent immediately reduced, but at the end of a period of 49 years, he became automatically the owner of his farm. The total sum to be advanced by the state was limited to £5 million, but this modest experiment formed the basis of all subsequent land purchase legislation down to the great measure of 1903. Nothing could have been more consonant with the best Conservative tradition than the Ashbourne Act. Can the same be said of the communications which in the autumn of 1885 took place between Mr. Parnell and Lord Carnarvon? That the new Lord Lieutenant favoured the principle of federalism was well known. He had already applied it to Canada, and had attempted to apply it to South Africa. Would he venture to recommend to his colleagues its application to Ireland? The happenings of 1885, though in the highest degree momentous, are still wrapped in some obscurity. But this much is certain. Within a few weeks of taking office, Lord Carnarvon met Parnell and listened sympathetically to the statement of his views. The fact of these meetings was communicated to the Prime Minister, but not to the Cabinet. In November, the Irish vote in English constituencies was given under orders from Parnell to the Tory candidates. The result precisely fulfilled the astute anticipation of the Irish leader. In the new Parliament he held the balance between parties. Had the Tories won a dozen more seats, he could have kept them in power. As it was, he could reduce the Liberals to impotence. No sooner was the verdict of the electorate given than Mr. Gladstone sent up his famous kite. It is now clear that during the autumn of 1885, if not before, his own mind had been tending in the direction of Home Rule. But until the elections were over he gave no clear sign. To him, Parnell's victory in Ireland appeared decisive. Enfranchised Ireland had now spoken. But he would gladly have seen the question settled by the Conservatives, and he actually opened the matter to the Premier's nephew, Mr. Balfour. Lord Salisbury, however, was not prepared for the plunge. As soon as he was assured of this, Mr. Gladstone turned him out. The new Parliament met on January 12, 1886. Before it was many days old, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and his Chief Secretary, Sir W. Hart Dyke, resigned, and Mr. W. H. Smith succeeded the latter with a seat in the Cabinet. On January 26th, notice was given that the new Chief Secretary would promptly introduce a fresh coercion bill for Ireland, and on the same night the Salisbury government found itself in a minority of 79. The immediate occasion was an amendment to the address regretting that no announcement had been made as to the provision of allotments and small holdings. Footnote. This was Mr. Jesse Colling's famous 3 acres and a cow amendment. End footnote. But though the talk was of English labourers, the mind of the House was intent upon Ireland. Lord Salisbury treated the vote as decisive, and Mr. Gladstone for the 3rd time became Prime Minister. But he was no longer the leader of a united Liberal party. Lord Hartington, Lord Selborne, Lord Northbrook, Mr. Goshen and Mr. Bright were notable absentees from the new Cabinet. Sir Henry James refused the Woolsack, and Mr. Chamberlain and Sir George Trevelyan accepted office under protest and resigned before the Home Rule Bill was introduced. In the task to which he now devoted himself, Gladstone found his right-hand man in Mr. John Morley, a brilliant man of letters of advanced Radical views, who had lately entered the House of Commons, and who now entered the Cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Lord Lieutenant. Other staunch adherents of the new policy were Lord Spencer, whose support was invaluable, and Mr. Childers, Home Secretary, whose conversion had preceded that of his chief. Mr. Gladstone introduced the first Home Rule Bill on April 8, 1886. There was to be a legislative body in Dublin to deal with Irish affairs in strict subordination to the Imperial Parliament. In the legislature there were to be 2 orders, one consisting of 28 representative peers of Ireland and 75 members elected by select constituencies, the other consisting of 206 members elected by the existing constituencies. The 2 orders were to sit together, though either might demand a separate vote and thus exercise a suspensive veto upon the other. The Irish legislature was forbidden to make laws relating to the Crown, the Army, Navy, or Defences, treaties, peace or war, trade and navigation, coinage, customs, excise, and many other matters. Nor was it to establish or endow any particular church. Irish members were no longer to sit in the Imperial Parliament. As to the executive, the Lord Lieutenant was to be converted into a constitutional ruler assisted by a Privy Council, but acting ordinarily on the advice of ministers responsible to the local legislature. This executive was ultimately to control the police and to appoint the judges. Into the complicated financial proposals it is unnecessary to enter, except to recall the fact that alongside the Home Rule Bill was a land bill, giving to the Irish landlords the option of selling their estates normally at 20 years' purchase of the net rental. That the terms of this latter bill affected prejudicially the fortunes of the former is hardly open to doubt. Apart from this, however, Mr. Gladstone was leading a forlorn hope. Against him was arrayed not only the regular opposition in unbroken unity, but the flower of the Liberal party in Parliament, and outside it almost the whole aristocracy of intellect, of hereditary rank and of commerce. In the House of Commons, Lord Hartington led the opposition to the bill, and, powerfully supported by Mr. Chamberlain, defeated it on second reading by a majority of 30. In that majority were no fewer than 93 Liberals. Mr. Gladstone immediately decided upon an appeal to the constituencies, and their verdict was conclusive. The Gladstonian Liberals returned less than 200 strong. Parnell had 85 followers. The Unionists numbered close on 400. Mr. Gladstone resigned office before the meeting of the new Parliament. The old Liberal party was irretrievably shattered, and for 20 years, with one brief and unimportant interlude, the Unionists retained both office and power. With characteristic modesty, Lord Salisbury desired that the first place in the new ministry should be taken by Lord Hartington. But the Liberal Unionists, while promising unofficial support, were not yet prepared for fusion with the Conservatives, and the new cabinet was drawn entirely from the latter party. Tardy and transient amends were made to Lord Iddesleigh, who became Foreign Secretary. Lord Randolph Churchill led the House of Commons as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Sir Michael Hicks Beach loyally accepted the Chief Secretaryship to the Lord Lieutenant. The task before him was no easy one. Twice within the last 12 months had the enfranchised Celts of Ireland declared with virtual unanimity in favour of Home Rule. Their cause had now been espoused with enthusiasm by the most conspicuous statesman of the day. For a moment it had seemed not impossible that his genius and vigour might prevail. Once again, as in the days of Lord Fitzwilliam, their hopes had been raised, only to be dashed to the ground. How were the Unionists going to tackle the situation? Lord Salisbury had recently declared that what Ireland needed was 20 years of consistently strong and resolute government. The restoration of social order was therefore the first plank in the Unionist platform. Sir Redvers Buller, a distinguished soldier, was sent into the west of Ireland to suppress outrages and crimes, whereupon Mr. Parnell produced in his Tenants' Relief Bill an alternative prescription. In Ireland, as in England, there was genuine distress among agriculturists, but whereas in England the landlords behaved with extraordinary consideration toward their tenants, in Ireland there were some landlords who were disposed to press their legal rights to the uttermost. Parnell therefore proposed that rents fixed before 1885 should be reduced by the Land Court, that leaseholders should be brought under the Act of 1881, and that no tenant should be evicted who paid up his arrears and half his rent. The bill was rejected by a majority of nearly 100. Prompt came the response from Ireland in the plan of campaign. This new strategical device was invented by Mr. Dillon and Mr. William O'Brien, and was frowned upon by their leader. The device was simplicity itself. The tenants of any given estate were to agree on a fair rent. Should their offer be declined, the money was to be paid into a war chest and spent on organized resistance to evictions. The plan was inaugurated in the autumn of 1886, and throughout 1887 the campaign was vigorously sustained. It was a direct challenge to the elementary principles of law, and no government worthy of the name could have refused to take it up. Consequently, the first business of the new session, 1887, was a bill to amend the criminal law in Ireland. Before this bill was introduced, the personnel of the ministry had already undergone considerable modification. On the eve of Christmas 1886, the world was startled by the announcement that Lord Salisbury's principal lieutenant had resigned. Lord Randolph Churchill's ministerial career had scarcely begun. By a few months' tenure of the India Office, he had established a reputation as a first-rate administrator. A few weeks' leadership of the House of Commons had convinced friends and foes alike that he would take rank among the great parliamentarians of the Victorian era. He had earned the warm approbation of the sovereign, and in the party his supremacy was unquestioned. Well might he regard himself as not only omnipotent but indispensable. Some of his opinions may have sat lightly upon him. In regard to national economy he had genuine convictions. He believed with Mr. Gladstone that, so far from being incompatible with efficiency, economy is the complement and test of it. He was determined, moreover, to enforce his views upon his colleagues. Neither Mr. W. H. Smith at the War Office nor Lord George Hamilton at the Admiralty would abate materially their demands. The Prime Minister supported them, and Lord Randolph resigned. That he expected to be recalled on his own terms can hardly be doubted, but he had made one grave miscalculation. He afterwards confessed to have forgotten Goshen. Lord Salisbury's first impulse was to renew to Lord Hartington the generous offer declined in July. The latter adhered to his decision, but was willing that Mr. Goshen, who had held no office since 1874, should enter the Conservative government. Mr. Goshen therefore succeeded Lord Randolph at the Exchequer, and proved a tower of strength to the party with which he was henceforth associated. Mr. W. H. Smith resigned the War Office to Mr. Edward Stanhope, and himself became First Lord of the Treasury and Leader of the House of Commons. These changes involved others. Lord Iddesleigh, with characteristic unselfishness, had placed his seat in the Cabinet at the Premier's disposal in order to facilitate negotiations with the Liberal Unionists. It was, however, from the newspapers that he first learnt that his offer had been accepted, and that Lord Salisbury had himself taken over the Foreign Office, January 4th, 1887. He declined the presidency of the Council, and on January 12th the country was shocked to learn that he had died suddenly in the anteroom of the Premier's official residence at 10 Downing Street. Thus closed, amid circumstances almost tragic, a life of high utility and complete blamelessness. 3 months later, Sir M. Hicks Beach was compelled by temporary ill health to resign the Irish office, in which he was succeeded by Mr. A. J. Balfour. It was Mr. Balfour who defined and carried through the Unionist policy in Ireland. A man of high courage, perfect temper, and winning personality, he was admirably qualified for his difficult task. Neither lawlessness in Ireland nor abuse at Westminster disturbed his serenity or deflected his course of action. Having armed himself with a new and effective weapon, he pursued the policy marked out for him without haste, without acerbity, and with unfaltering consistency. The new weapon was the Criminal Law Amendment Act, Ireland, of 1887. This act differed from previous coercion acts in that its provisions were permanent. The Lord Lieutenant was authorized to declare an association to be unlawful and to proclaim a district as disturbed. The powers of the resident magistrates, Balfour's removables as they were nicknamed, were greatly enlarged. In particular, they were empowered to try summarily cases of conspiracy. The passing of this Crimes Act was much facilitated, on the one hand, by the new rules of procedure adroitly carried through the House by Mr. Smith, on the other by the publication in the Times of a series of articles on Parnellism and crime. The object of the articles was to establish the complicity of the Nationalist leaders in recent agrarian crime. On April 18th, 1887, the date appointed for the second reading of the Crimes Bill, the Times printed what was purported to be a letter from Mr. Parnell to an anonymous correspondent apologizing for having had to denounce the murder of Mr. Burke in Phoenix Park. This famous letter was subsequently proved to be a forgery, but at the moment Parnell's denial of its authenticity was not believed, and the publication served its immediate purpose. Coercion, however, was not to stand alone. A Land Act, 1887, gave power to the court to revise the rents judicially fixed and admitted leaseholders to the benefits of the Act of 1881. Lawlessness probably reached its acme in 1887. Balfour and his Crimes Act were defied by the Nationalist leaders, but in July 18 counties were proclaimed under the Act. In August the National League was proclaimed as an unlawful association. In September an affray at Michaelstown resulted in the loss of several lives, and before the close of the year Mr. William O'Brien and several other members of Parliament and Mr. T.D. Sullivan, Lord Mayor of Dublin, were convicted under the Crimes Act and imprisoned. It was a struggle à outrance between the forces of order and disorder, but the law, thanks to the steady persistence of Mr. Balfour, slowly but surely won. Meanwhile, much discussion was taking place in the House of Commons as to what action, if any, should be taken to sift the allegations of the Times against Parnell and his colleagues. Mr. Parnell asked for a select committee, which the government refused to grant. In its stead, they eventually appointed a special commission to investigate the charges. 3 distinguished judges, Sir James Hannan, Sir John Day, and Sir A. L. Smith, consented to serve, and on September 17th the commission was opened. It was, in effect if not in form, a state trial of high significance. The Attorney General was the principal counsel for the Times, Sir Charles Russell, afterwards Lord Russell of Culloden and Lord Chief Justice of England, for the defendants. The commission sat for 128 days and examined more than 450 witnesses. Only at one moment during this protracted period was the dramatic interest really tense. That was when, towards the end of February, an old and broken man was put into the witness box and subjected to a scathing cross-examination by Sir Charles Russell. The man was Richard Pigott, a needy journalist, and now revealed to the world as the forger of the famous letter. After enduring torture in the witness box for 2 days, the miserable man fled the country, leaving a full confession behind him. Before the police could execute a warrant for his arrest, he shot himself in Madrid, March 1st. The Times offered an apology and withdrew the forged documents. With this withdrawal, much of the popular interest in the case evaporated, but by no means all its significance. On February 13th, 1890, the commissioners presented their report. They found, of course, that the facsimile letter was a forgery, and they acquitted Mr. Parnell and his colleagues of the charge of insincerity in their denunciation of the Phoenix Park murders. They found that the respondents collectively were not members of a conspiracy having for its object the absolute independence of Ireland, but that some of them had established the Land League with the intention by its means to bring about the absolute independence of Ireland, and that they had conspired by means of an agrarian agitation to impoverish and expel from the country the Irish landlords who were styled the English garrison, that they had incited to the intimidation that produced crime, and had promoted the defense of agrarian crime. What was to be done with the report? The government moved that the House thank the commissioners for their just and impartial conduct, adopt the report, and enter it upon the journals. Mr. Gladstone, on the contrary, tried to persuade the House to record its reprobation of the false charges of the gravest and most odious description, based on calumny and on forgery, that had been brought against members of the House. It was clear that the terms of Gladstone's amendment were an exculpation far beyond the findings of the Commission. It was rejected by a substantial majority, and the government had its way. No impartial person could interpret the findings of the Commission as a general acquittal for the Parnellites. Nevertheless, it was inevitable that the revelation of the carelessness and blunders of the Times and the exposure of Pigott's forgery should have caused some revulsion of popular feeling. Mr. Gladstone and his party were immensely elated by the issue, and the Unionists correspondingly chagrined. But the elation was short-lived. Mr. Parnell had entered an action for libel against the Times in 1888. In February 1890, the case was compromised by the payment of $5,000 damages. Before the compromise was reached, Parnell was already involved in litigation of another kind. On November 17, 1890, Captain O'Shea obtained a decree nisi against his wife, with Parnell as co-respondent. Parnell affected to believe that the divorce suit was a matter of merely personal interest. The organs of nonconformity sounded another note, and Mr. Gladstone quickly re-echoed it. On November 24th, he expressed the view that Parnell's continuance in the leadership would be productive of consequences disastrous in the highest degree to the cause of Ireland. But on the 25th, the Irish party, ignorant of Mr. Gladstone's letter, re-elected Parnell as sessional chairman of the party. Mr. Gladstone immediately published his letter, and the thundercloud burst. For some weeks the utmost confusion prevailed in the Home Rule camp. Mr. Dillon and Mr. O'Brien, then in the United States, called upon Parnell to resign. Mr. Healy vehemently urged the same conclusion upon his colleague in Committee Room No. 15. The Roman Catholic bishops issued a pronouncement of similar purport. But Parnell held grimly on. He would neither abdicate nor submit to deposition. At length, December 6th, a majority of his colleagues, 44 in number, withdrew their allegiance and elected Mr. Justin McCarthy as their leader. 26 remained faithful to the old chief. For 9 months Parnell made frantic efforts to maintain his position in Ireland. His pluck was superb, but all the cards were against him, and on October 6, 1891, the painful struggle was terminated by his premature death. Thus was removed from the political stage one of the greatest personalities of the century. On the list of Irish patriots, Mr. Gladstone placed him with or next to Daniel O'Connell, deeming him to be of more muscular and stronger character than Grattan. That he loved Ireland is certain. Whether his love for Ireland was as intense as his hatred of England is doubtful. Parnell's death overshadowed another event of some parliamentary significance. On the very same day that Parnell died, under circumstances almost tragic, at Brighton, there passed away, full of years and honour, Mr. W. H. Smith, the leader of the House of Commons. Succeeding to the leadership at a critical moment, Mr. Smith had done yeoman service to his party. Disarmingly simple, transparently honest, invariably courteous, he retained the respect of his opponents and won the affection of his friends. By universal acclaim, the brilliant Chief Secretary was called to fill the vacant place. Mr. Balfour had accomplished the task to which he had set his hand in Ireland. He had shown himself sympathetic toward undeserved suffering, quick to devise healing remedies, but above all inflexibly firm in the vindication of law. He had greatly extended the operation of the Ashbourne Act, and had set up a commission for dealing with congested districts. He proposed in 1892 to crown his work by a large measure of local government, but the scheme was coldly received, and early in June it was abandoned. A few weeks later Parliament was dissolved. The general election which ensued grievously disappointed the hopes of Mr. Gladstone. Instead of the majority of at least 100 on which he had confidently counted, the country gave him one of 40, and that highly precarious in composition. England was still staunchly Unionist, but was overborne by the Celtic fringe. In the new Parliament the Unionists numbered 315, the Gladstonian Liberals 269, and the Irish Home Rulers 81. In view of the composite majority opposed to him, Lord Salisbury decided to meet Parliament, but on an amendment to the address he was beaten by a majority of 40, and in August he gave way to Mr. Gladstone. The Cabinet of 1892 differed little in personnel from that of 1886, but was reinforced by Mr. H. H. Asquith, a young Oxonian who had quickly established a reputation at the bar and in Parliament, and now became Home Secretary; by Mr. Bryce, a great jurist; by Mr. H. H. Fowler, a shrewd provincial solicitor, who did admirable work at the Local Government Board, and others. The new Ministry at once, September 1892, suspended by proclamation the operation of the Crimes Act in Ireland, and thus cleared the decks for the great measure of 1893. The second edition of Home Rule was disclosed to the House by the Prime Minister on February 13, 1893. In several important particulars it differed from the first. The single-chamber device with its 2 orders was dropped, and the bicameral system was frankly adopted. The Legislative Council of 48 members was to be elected for 8 years by persons who owned or occupied land of the rateable value of £20 per annum. The Legislative Assembly was to consist of 103 members, elected by the existing constituencies, except Trinity College. Should the two chambers disagree, the question was to be decided, but only after the lapse of 2 years, in joint session by a majority. In the original draft, Irish members to the number of 80 were to be retained at Westminster, but not to vote on questions affecting Great Britain exclusively. This in and out clause was subsequently dropped, and the Irish members were retained for all purposes. The bill, after prolonged discussion, was pushed through the House of Commons by the amazing energy of Mr. Gladstone, but in the Lords it was thrown out by 419 to 41, September 8th. An immediate appeal to the country might have given Mr. Gladstone the mandate he wanted to deal with the House of Lords, or it might not. Denied the opportunity of bringing the matter to an issue, Mr. Gladstone decided that his part in the great drama was played. Weighed down by increasing infirmity of sight and hearing, and sincerely desiring a quiet interval between the turmoil of politics and the grave, he resigned office in 1894. The interval he had craved lasted for 4 years. He emerged from his retirement to plead the cause of the Armenian Christians in 1896, but on May 19, 1898, after some months of suffering, he passed away. Noble tributes were paid to his memory in both Houses of Parliament. His body lay in state in Westminster Hall and was afterwards buried in the Abbey. One of the ablest of his lieutenants has since painted his portrait in colours which will never fade. For a final appreciation of a statesman who played so large a part in contemporary affairs, who excited in unusual measure alike admiration and detestation, the time has not yet perhaps arrived. But this much may be said. Though lacking the simplicity and directness characteristic of Bright, he was a consummate orator. Endowed by nature with a commanding presence and a sonorous voice, he acquired by art an extraordinary command of language and uncommon felicity of illustration. As a debater he was not equal to Disraeli, lacking his imperturbable temper and his sense of humour, and although he could rouse intense enthusiasm among his followers, he cannot be said, like Peel, to have played on the House like an old fiddle. Great as an orator, he was still greater as a man. Marvellous in the versatility of his interests and touching life on many sides, a genuine scholar of the old Oxford school, and a devoted son of the Anglican Church. As a statesman his greatest strength lay in finance. He had been admirably trained in the school of Peel, and he was, throughout his career, a jealous guardian of the public purse. Perhaps he spent too much of his ministerial life at the Treasury. Undoubtedly he spent too much of his public life in the House of Commons. Consequently his statesmanship was of the strictly parliamentary type. His gaze was too closely concentrated upon tactics, sometimes, as in 1884-1885, with disastrous results. To say that his outlook was insular would be untrue. No man had a more vivid sympathy with oppressed nationalities, or a more touching faith in the universal efficacy of parliamentary institutions. But although he was frequently aroused to vehement speech by tales of oppression, and occasionally to prompt action, as for example by the bad faith of Russia in regard to the Penjdeh incident, yet his interest in external affairs was intermittent, and his temper in such matters only was apt to be procrastinating. Nevertheless, no one could look upon him without a sense that here was a man cast in a heroic mould, and that whether he was right on a given question or wrong, in nothing was he less than great. After Mr. Gladstone's resignation, the Queen selected Lord Rosebery as his successor, and for 15 months he carried on the government. Sir William Harcourt succeeded to the leadership of the House of Commons, and the interest of the session of 1894 centred on his budget. The Queen's speech of 1895 contained a portentous list of measures, including Welsh disestablishment, licensing reform, and the abolition of plural voting, but no part of this ambitious programme was brought to legislative fruition. On June 21st, the Government was beaten on a War Office vote and promptly resigned. The Queen again sent for Lord Salisbury, who for the third time became Prime Minister. No longer, however, was he at the head of a purely Conservative administration. Things had moved fast since 1886, when Lord Hartington had twice declined the generous offer of Lord Salisbury. He and Mr. Chamberlain now agreed that the time had come for an even closer alliance between the two wings of the Unionist party. Early in 1887, an attempt had been made by a round-table conference to find a basis of compromise on Irish government between Mr. Chamberlain and the Liberal Home Rulers. But the attempt proved abortive and was not renewed. On the other hand, the working alliance between the Conservatives and the Liberal Unionists had now been maintained for nearly 10 years. To Mr. Gladstone's second attempt to carry Home Rule in 1893, the latter had offered uncompromising opposition. On succeeding to the premiership, Lord Rosebery had made the significant admission that before Home Rule was conceded, England, as the predominant member of the partnership of the three kingdoms, will have to be convinced of its justice. But the schism in the old Liberal party was now too deep for healing, and unless the Liberal Unionist leaders were to renounce forever the hope of official service, there remained to them no alternative but coalition with the Conservatives. One of those leaders conceived himself to be charged with a political mission far transcending the claims of party. He was quick also to discern the signs of the times. The centre of political interest was shifting rapidly from the centre to the circumference. The strong administration of Mr. Balfour, the repeated failure of Mr. Gladstone, the agrarian revolution now in quiet process of accomplishment, all these things seemed to promise an abatement in the acuteness of the Irish controversy. The majority given to Mr. Gladstone in 1892 was not only small but precarious. The predominant partner remained wholly unconvinced. The mind of the nation was turning in another direction. On the formation of the new ministry, some surprise was felt when Mr. Chamberlain selected the Colonial Office. It was, in fact, an unmistakable indication that he was conscious of the trend of opinion. Lord Hartington, who had now succeeded to the Dukedom of Devonshire, became President of the Council. Lord Lansdowne, another Liberal Unionist, accepted the War Office. Mr. Goshen, the Admiralty, and Mr. Henry James took a peerage and the Chancellorship of the Duchy. Such appointments not only brought an immense accession of strength to Lord Salisbury's ministry, but marked a notable stage in the evolution of a new political party. Of this evolution the country evidently approved. The new ministry wound up the business of the session with all possible speed, saved a few useful measures from the Liberal wreck, and in July made their appeal to the constituencies. The electorate was asked to confirm the verdict pronounced by the House of Lords upon the second edition of Home Rule. The reply was unequivocal. In the new Parliament, Unionists numbered 411, Liberals 177, and Nationalists of both sections 82. The country had made up its mind on Home Rule and wanted to hear no more of it. For a decade its wishes were respected. In 1898 through 1899, the Government carried two measures of first-rate importance. The Local Government Act of 1898 applied to Ireland, the local principle which was already revolutionizing local administration on this side of the Channel. That this Act opened out a great vista of useful and patriotic work to Irishmen of all parties cannot be questioned. The second measure was of even greater significance. In form, it only established a Department of Agriculture and other industries and technical instruction in Ireland. In effect, it initiated a social and economic revolution. Worked in close connection with the Local Government Act of 1898, and interpreted and administered with rare wisdom and devotion by Sir Horace Plunkett, it has verily laid the foundations of a new Ireland, and has taught some lessons which Great Britain has yet to learn. With the enactment of legislation so full of happy augury for the future, the historian of the 19th century may be well content to close an important section of his work. End of Section 51. Section 52 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 26, Epilogue, 1885 to 1901, Democracy and Empire, Close of the Victorian Era, Part 2. In contemporary interest, South Africa was rapidly eclipsing Ireland. But before we pass to colonial and imperial topics, a word may be said as to domestic affairs. It is a grave, though common, misconception to suppose that the last years of the Victorian era constituted in this respect a period of stagnation. It is true that the fervour of Mr. Gladstone compelled the Liberal party to concentrate their energies on a single issue, but except for an unimportant interlude, administrative and legislative responsibility was not theirs, and the Tories, reinforced by the leader of the new radicalism, betrayed no pedantic adherence to old-fashioned formulas. The laissez-faire doctrines of the Manchester school were light-heartedly jettisoned. More and more reliance was placed upon the efficacy of the elective principle. Heavier and heavier functions were imposed on the state, and municipalities invaded the sphere of commercial enterprise. This was one manifestation of the new spirit, but there were many others. Among them, not the least significant, was a rising self-consciousness or class consciousness in the ranks of the manual laborers. The last period of the 19th century was punctuated by a series of strikes and labor disputes. By no means all of them were due to disregarded demands for higher wages. The distribution of the products of industry was only one factor in the economic problem. Searchings of heart went deeper than that. Fundamentals as to the conduct of business and the organization of industry were called in question. The manual worker had not only learnt his letters, but had attained to the full stature of citizenship. That this should react upon his industrial status was inevitable. He refused to be regarded as a mere hand, a mechanical cog in the great wheel of industry. He demanded recognition as a man, a workman, and a citizen. We have treated the evolution of representative democracy as one of the outstanding features of the 19th century. But the Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 and 5 affected only central government. By the Act of 1835, the same democratic principle was applied to the municipalities. The last years of the century witnessed the completion of the work by the democratization of rural government. Both the great parties contributed to this development. The Act of 1888 provided for the creation of 62 administrative counties, some of them coterminous with the historic shires, some representing subdivisions of the same, and some 60 county boroughs, towns with over 50,000 inhabitants. In each county or county borough, the Act set up a council consisting in part of councillors elected for a term of 3 years directly by the ratepayers, in part of aldermen co-opted by the councillors. To these councils were transferred the administrative functions of quarter sessions, while the latter retained their judicial functions. The control of the police was confided to a joint committee of the county council and quarter sessions. A similar act was passed for Scotland in 1889, and in 1894 the elective principle was extended to parishes and to intermediate areas known as urban or rural districts. These acts did much to evolve administrative order out of the chaos which had been created by generations of piecemeal legislation. Authorities were concentrated, areas were readjusted and simplified. More than this, the Acts provided a cadre and machinery for a number of social and economic reforms of far-reaching significance. The new councils have proved themselves undeniably efficient, but not economical. Local taxation and local indebtedness have increased with appalling rapidity. In 1875, the liabilities of local authorities in England and Wales stood, in round figures, at £92 million. In 1905, at £482,984,000. Not less appalling to old-fashioned economists was the growth of imperial taxation. Sir Robert Peel's last budget, 1846, provided for an expenditure of £55,000,000. Sir Michael Hicks Beach, in 1898, had to find £102,000,000. Today the expenditure approaches £200,000,000. These facts give additional significance to financial policy, but during the period now under review, two budgets only call for special notice. The first was Mr. Goshen's of 1888. The second was Sir William Harcourt's in 1894. In 1888, Mr. Goshen carried through a scheme for the conversion of the greater part of the funded debt of the country. The fact that consols bearing interest at 3% stood considerably above par enabled Mr. Goshen to effect an immediate reduction of interest to 2¾ and a further reduction after 1903 to 2½ %. Mr. Goshen's city experience and connections stood him in good stead. The hook was craftily baited and greedily swallowed. Nor did the policy of the transaction lack justification at the time, or for some years to come. In 1897, Goshen's touched 113 7/8. The South African War and the marked rise in the rate of interest which followed thereon put a different complexion on the matter. Sir William Harcourt's budget of 1894 was notable for a marked increase in direct taxation in the form of death duties. The convenience of this method of raising revenue is unquestioned. Whether revenue so raised ought in strictness to be applied to any purpose save the extinction of capital liabilities is a much more doubtful point. The immediate justification was the fact that by both parties social reforms were being pushed forward in hot haste, and that reforms have to be paid for. Throughout the greater part of this period, social conditions caused grave disquietude. The agricultural depression, which began in 1879, became steadily worse. Trade was shifty, employment was precarious, industrial disputes incessant. The capital was seriously alarmed by labor riots in 1887, and in 1889 75,000 dock workers were on strike in London, the result being a notable improvement in working conditions. A prolonged strike among the gas workers, 1889 to 1890, led to the adoption in many gas works of a system of profit sharing. Railway porters, brickmakers, boot and shoemakers, colliers and iron workers followed suit in 1890. Things were no better in 1891, and the government therefore appointed a strong commission to inquire into questions affecting the relations between employers and employed and the conditions of labor. This step, wise in itself, had no immediate effect upon the situation. The cotton trade of Lancashire was paralyzed by a dispute which lasted from November 1892 to March of 1893. Hardly was this war ended by the Brooklands Agreement when the great coal strike of 1893 broke out and lasted for more than 3 months. In 1895 there was a long drawn-out dispute in the shipbuilding yards of Glasgow and Belfast. The year which witnessed the great coal strike was noteworthy for the formation, under the presidency of an advanced socialist, of the Independent Labour Party. A year earlier, 1892, the government created at the Board of Trade a special labour department which has done useful work in the collection and dissemination of statistical information. A Board of Agriculture had been created in 1889. Meanwhile, the legislature was not idle in regard to economic and social problems. The establishment of a gratuitous system of elementary education, 1891, another result of Mr. Goshen's skillful finance, has been already noted. An Act for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children and prohibiting their employment under the age of 10 was passed in 1889. Local authorities were encouraged to insist on the notification of infectious diseases, 1889, and to prohibit the sale of milk from dairies thus notified, 1890. In 1890 they were empowered under a drastic Housing Act to purchase in sanitary areas, demolish unfit dwellings, and erect new ones. In 1892 the rural districts got their turn. Under the Small Holdings Act, county councils were empowered to purchase land and to resell in quantities of not less than 1 and not more than 50 acres to actual cultivators, to whom 3/4 of the purchase money might be advanced. Holdings of not more than 10 acres might be let to laborers. The money for the transaction was to be borrowed from the Public Works Loan Commissioners. Useful extensions of the acknowledged principles of the Factory Acts were achieved in 1891 and 1895, and in 1892 a Shop Hours Act was passed. It prohibited the employment of persons under 18 years of age for more than 74 hours per week, including meal times, in shops. Of much wider scope and significance was the Workmen's Compensation Act, passed in 1897. This Act contained a new principle fearlessly applied. Henceforward, employers were to be liable to pay compensation for death or injury, even though their workmen had been guilty of contributory negligence, and they themselves had not. The operation of the Act was, in the first instance, confined to mines, factories, railways, quarries, docks, and engineering sheds, but nevertheless it registered an important stage on the road toward compulsory insurance. The expenses of the Act were charged wholly upon the employers. These acts and others of like import were sufficiently indicative of the new spirit which was beginning to permeate the nation and the legislature. It was stimulated partly by an awakening of the social conscience, and partly by outside pressure exerted by organized bodies of manual workers. Among these the most powerful were the trade unions, whose aims were now undergoing considerable modification. That they should rely in increasing degree upon political action was a natural result of the democratization of the parliamentary machine. That their demands should assume more and more socialistic hue was perhaps equally inevitable. In both respects, the new unionism owed much to the powerful leadership of a new personality in English politics. This was Mr. John Burns, a young engineer who first obtained notoriety in connection with the riots in Trafalgar Square, who then made his mark on the London County Council, and before long impressed himself upon the attention of the House of Commons. Great, however, as was the awakening of the social conscience, it is not in this direction that the historian must look for the characteristic movement of the closing years of the Victorian era. On June 21st, 1887, the aging sovereign celebrated the 50th anniversary of her accession to the throne. The occasion evoked a remarkable demonstration of loyalty and affection among all classes of her people at home and her subjects overseas. The enthusiasm was more than redoubled when 10 years later she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. On both occasions there was a solemn service of thanksgiving, a brilliant procession through the streets of London, and a great review of battleships in the Solent. Yet there was a difference between them. In the first procession the central feature was the brilliant bodyguard of princes, sons, sons-in-law, and grandsons of the Queen. The second was as a military spectacle, even more splendid, but apart from the figure of the aged monarch, touching in complete simplicity, public attention was riveted upon a group of black-coated citizens who formed a part, to the outward eye an incongruous part, of the superb pageant. These were the prime ministers of the self-governing dominions and other representatives of overseas colonies. Their presence struck the keynote of the imperial jubilee. The jubilee celebrations had a threefold significance. They marked the zenith of the Queen's personal popularity among her subjects. They were a recognition of her dynastic position in Europe, and above all, they forged fresh links between the imperial crown and the oversea dominions, between the mother and the daughter lands. Lord Beaconsfield would have given much to have seen those days. In a remarkable degree they vindicated his prescience. As a factor in domestic politics, the Crown had sensibly declined in importance during the last 200 years. The Jubilees brought home to the imagination of the dullard that the Crown had a new function to fulfil, a new role to play as the representative of imperial interests and the embodiment of imperial sentiment. The increasing recognition of this sentiment was the characteristic differentia of the last years of the Victorian era. In the first decades of the reign, the prevailing sentiment had been weary impatience of a useless though temporary burden. That the colonies would in no short time sever the ties that bound them to the motherland was the hope of many and the expectation of all. The argument of Sir George Cornwall Lewis's essay on the government of dependencies commanded in the 40s all but universal assent. So late as 1872, Tennyson had to rebuke the Times for having advised the Canadians to take up their freedom as the days of their apprenticeship were over. But the Times represented prevailing sentiment more truly than Tennyson. The turn of the tide did not come until the 80s. Many things then contributed to swell it. The publication of Sir John Seeley's Expansion of England in 1883 was at once a cause and an indication of the change. The political future, he maintained, belonged to the big states. The Western powers were quick to take the hint, and the scramble for Africa began. That scramble was due essentially to a realization of the rapid shrinkage of the world. Science was annihilating time and space, and the remotest corners of the earth were being brought within the sphere of European politics. In Great Britain, the new spirit was stimulated partly by the apprehension of these facts, partly by the activity of neighbours and rivals, but above all by multiplied manifestations of the rising imperial temper in the colonies themselves. The year which witnessed the first Jubilee witnessed also, by a happy coincidence, the meeting of the first colonial conference. The conference was the outcome of the efforts of a band of enthusiasts, among whom W. E. Forster, Edward Stanhope, and Lord Rosebery were conspicuous. Its first fruit was the Imperial Defence Act of 1888 for the increase of the Australasian squadron. The loyal and spontaneous offer of the Australasian colonies to provide military contingents for the war in the Sudan in 1885 had raised the whole problem of imperial cooperation for defence and war. The splendid services rendered by the colonies in the South African War, 1899 to 1902, made a further and profound impression both upon the Britons of the homeland and upon their neighbours. It was manifest that for military purposes the Empire must henceforward be regarded as a unit. Meanwhile, the experiment of a conference initiated in 1887 was repeated at Ottawa in 1894, and again in London in 1897, 1902, and 1911. These conferences have touched very cautiously, when at all, the larger question of constitutional reconstruction for the Empire as a whole, but in regard to defence, communications, shipping, and many minor matters, they have rendered incalculable service to the cause of imperial unity. Primarily, however, they have been valuable in bringing together, in friendly and intimate communication, the responsible statesmen of the mother and the daughter lands. Meanwhile, the actual expansion of territory has been far from insignificant. Communication with the Far East was rendered more secure by the annexation of the island of Socotra in 1886, and by the establishment of a protectorate over North Borneo in 1888. More significant was the revival of a device which, since the days of Adam Smith, had fallen into some discredit. The statesmen of the 17th century cordially encouraged the concession of charters to companies of merchants. Such concessions brought to the Crown a maximum of profit with a minimum of responsibility. Adam Smith condemned the confusion between political and commercial purposes, holding that the function of a merchant was inconsistent with that of a sovereign. Nonetheless, this method of colonization had solid advantages, and in the last decades of the 19th century they became increasingly obvious. The company of merchants took risks and tried experiments. The Crown and the nation reaped where they had sown. The device seemed to be particularly appropriate to Africa, upon which the attention of the European powers was largely concentrated during the last 15 years of the century. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 initiated the scramble for African territory. British advance can here be indicated only by a bare enumeration of dates. In the south, a protectorate was established over Bechuanaland, 1885. On the west coast, over the Niger territory, 1885. And in the same year, a charter was granted to the Royal Niger Company. But chartered companies and protectorates are, as a rule, transitory phases, and in 1900 Nigeria was transferred to the Crown. On the east coast, the Chartered Company of East Africa, 1888, similarly prepared the way for the direct sovereignty of the Crown, 1896. In 1889, a charter was granted to the South African Company, which has built up a great power in Matabeleland and Mashonaland, and in the same year Central Africa was declared to be under British protection. In 1890, Lord Salisbury concluded a comprehensive agreement with Germany, one of the fruits of which was a British protectorate over Zanzibar. Germany herself was established on the east coast, in the hinterland of Zanzibar, on the southwest from Angola to Cape Colony, while in the northwest she acquired Togoland, a strip of territory between the British Gold Coast and Dahomey, and the Cameroons, a large tract to the southeast of Nigeria. With Portugal, Lord Salisbury came to terms in 1891, and with France in reference to West Africa in 1898. Further treaties were concluded with Germany in regard to Portuguese Africa in 1898 and to the Sudan in 1899. It was generally held that Heligoland, ceded to Germany in 1890, was a cheap price to pay for the African agreement, and in any case the partition of Africa will probably be accounted Lord Salisbury's most enduring achievement in the domain of foreign policy. But it was not only Africa that was brought within the sphere of Western statesmanship. The attack of Japan upon Korea in 1894 proclaimed to the world the entrance of a new power into world politics. China intervened to save Korea from the grasp of Japan, and the latter promptly turned upon the mediator, captured Port Arthur, and imposed upon China the Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895. China was obliged to cede the Linotung Peninsula, the island of Formosa, and to promise a large indemnity. But Europe could not see with unconcern the rise of a new power in the Far East. Russia, therefore, with France and Germany, stepped in to deprive Japan of the fruits of victory, and having come to the aid of China, proceeded to claim her reward. Germany obtained a lease of Kiautschou in 1898, and Russia a similar lease of Port Arthur in 1899. England, fearful of being left in the cold, obtained Wei Hei Wei, and France got concessions from Tonkin. These encroachments roused into fresh life the old hostility of the Chinese to Western influences, and in 1899 a national uprising, led by the Boxers, threatened the extermination of all foreigners in China. Japan joined the Western powers in the task of rescuing their countrymen from Peking, and in 1901 peace was restored. A year later the world was startled to learn that Great Britain had so far emerged from her traditional diplomatic isolation as to conclude an alliance with Japan. To this significant step Great Britain was perhaps induced by a recognition of the vulnerability of her position in the Pacific. The material development of the Australasian colonies had not kept pace with their constitutional evolution. Between 1854 and 1890, all these colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, Queensland, Western Australia, and New Zealand, attained to the full dignity of responsible government. What they continued to lack was not government, but subjects. The vast spaces of the great southern continents were virtually unpeopled. The spirit of high protection ran riot, immigration was discouraged, and Australasian democracy was primarily concerned to keep up the price of labour. Mingled with this motive was the laudable ambition to preserve Australia as a white man's country. To the realization of this and similar ambitions some closer form of political union was essential, but federation was in Australia a plant of slow and timid growth. Ever since 1847 the project had been intermittently discussed, but not until 1883 did it actually begin to take shape. Several things then combined to render the problem insistent. The question as to the desirability of imported Chinese labour for the mines, the escape of some French convicts from New Caledonia into Australian territory, rumours that France was intending to annex the New Hebrides, above all, Lord Derby's disavowal of the action of Queensland in setting up the British flag in New Guinea. Between 1883 and 1893, many conferences were held and many schemes were discussed, but in 1893 the question was temporarily suspended by a severe financial crisis. Between 1895 and 1899, the draftsmen were again continuously at work, and in the latter year a bill which expressed the mind of Australia was sent home for the approval of the Imperial Legislature. Thanks to the tact of Mr. Chamberlain, then Colonial Secretary, and of Mr. now Sir Edmund Barton, the bill became law with a single amendment as the Australian Commonwealth Act in 1900. It was the last great statute to which Queen Victoria gave her royal assent, and in doing so she expressed her fervent hope that the inauguration of the Commonwealth may ensure the increased prosperity and well-being of my loyal and beloved subjects in Australia. Happy was the fate which permitted the venerable sovereign to watch over the cradle of a new nation, but this function, inexpressively appropriate, was almost the last she performed. Her health, which throughout her reign had been remarkably robust, was now failing rapidly. She felt acutely the humiliation inflicted upon the country by the defeats to her arms in South Africa, but never did she show herself more truly the mother of her people than in the dark days of the winter of 1899 and 1900. She it was who insisted in December 1899 that large reinforcements should be sent out, and that Lord Roberts should be entrusted with the command. Having thus made adequate though tardy preparation, she faced the issue with calm courage and complete confidence. Despite failing health, she went in and out among her people, encouraging the fighters, consoling the wounded, comforting the mourners, warning and stimulating responsible ministers. She followed closely all the efforts of her soldiers in South Africa and cordially commended their successes. Especially did she appreciate the gallantry of the colonial contingents and of the Irish regiments. The latter's services she acknowledged with more than words. She gave them permission to wear a sprig of shamrock on St. Patrick's Day, and when the time came for her spring holiday in 1900, she determined instead of going to the South to devote it to Ireland. In this determination there was perhaps a tinge of self-reproach. She desired almost passionately, so we learn from one who knew her, to be loved by the Irish, but she had done little to win their love. Pathetically she strove at the last to make amends. Her last April she spent in Dublin, where she was enthusiastically welcomed by all classes. The strain of the effort was enormous, and combined with that of the South African War, it hastened her end. On January 2nd, 1901, she welcomed Lord Roberts on his return from South Africa, and on the 19th the public learnt that she was seriously ill. On the 22nd, in the presence of 2 sons, 3 daughters, and her grandson, the German Emperor, she passed away. She was in her 82nd year, and had reigned 63 years, 7 months, and 3 days. A little figure in a great age was Goldwin Smith's description of Queen Elizabeth. Untrue of Queen Elizabeth, it would be still less true of Queen Victoria. Her death marked the close of a great life, a great reign, and a great historical epoch. Her personal character was a compound of shrewdness, simplicity, and sincerity. She was, said John Bright, the most absolutely truthful person I have ever known. Her gift of sympathy was known to all. Her punctuality in business and her devotion to duty could be known to comparatively few. Yet all men could see how superbly she continued to stand sentry to the business of her empire, virtually to the end. The building of that empire was largely, as we have seen, the work of her reign, and she was unaffectedly proud of it. Her reign had other claims to distinction, which the foregoing pages have been intended to illustrate. Of the literature of the epoch no mention has been made, since the mention could only have been catalogic and perfunctory, nor of the achievements of science. Never were those achievements greater, and never were they applied with ampler generosity to the service of humanity. Whether regard be paid to the relief of human suffering, to the multiplication of utilities, or to the augmentation of wealth, the Victorian era incurred a heavy debt to the devoted workers in the scientific sphere. Not less impressive were the changes in the economic and social structure, the enlargement of bounds of commerce, the genesis of new forms of industrial activity, the development of the principle of cooperation and combination, the deepening sense of social responsibility and social solidarity. All these things were characteristic of the England of the 19th century. Nevertheless, our survey would seem to have substantiated the claim put forward in the opening pages of the work. Great as were its achievements in the domain of pure intellect, of applied science, of social service, and of industrial development, the 19th century will take rank among the ages by virtue of its contribution to political experiment and to the art of government. The oncoming of democracy and the growth of empire will to all time distinguish the Victorian era. End of Section 52. Recording by Pamela Nagami in Encino, California, June 2017. End of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransom Marriott.